Chapter 14. Strange emotions spread in the air. Shun Yu forgot to move for a moment and maintained the posture of half leaning on Shang Junlin. Shang Junlin didn't know what to think, but he didn't push him away at first. In the end, Shun Yu came back to his senses first and hurriedly retreated. Be careful. The road was slippery on a snowy day. Shun Yu retreated too quickly and almost slipped. Shang Junlin was quick to help him up. Shun Yu's emotions fluctuated too much. After calming down for a while, he saw the man's arm firmly supporting him. He lowered his eyes awkwardly. For a long time, the man still didn't show any signs of letting go of him. Shun Yu carefully glanced at him and asked, "Your Majesty?" "Yes." Shang Junlin's expression was calm and his eyes were clear. Obviously, he was in a normal state. Shun Yu secretly laughed at himself for overthinking. It was just an accidental touch. How could Shang Junlin lose his composure because of it? Go in. Okay. Shun Yu was sent back to his room by Shang Junlin. The two stayed for a while before Shang Junlin left. Shun Yu didn't take the accident to heart, but he didn't know how many waves were set off in Shang Junlin's heart at this moment. Shang Junlin went all the way back to the imperial study. Except for eunuch Meng, he dismissed all the servants. He couldn't focus on the official business that he usually handled easily. His mind was full of the soft touch on his chin. It was cold and soft. Shang Junlin couldn't help but reach out and touch the place where Shun Yu touched. A trace of confusion flashed through his eyes. Why? Eunuch Meng stood aside and looked down. He didn't dare to make a sound to disturb the emperor, who was in deep thought. Shun Yu woke up from his afternoon nap and was shocked to see the man sitting by the bed. "Why didn't your Majesty let someone call me?" Shun Yu sat up with the quilt. "I saw that you were sleeping soundly, so I didn't call you." Shang Junlin also couldn't figure out why he suddenly came to Yuzhong Palace and sat beside Shun Yu's bed for the whole afternoon. The man's expression remained the same. Shun Yu didn't think much about it. He got up and put on his clothes. "How long has His Majesty been here?" Shang Junlin lied without batting an eyelid. "I just got here not long ago." Mu Shi, who had been tidying up Shun Yu's outer robe for more than an hour, glanced at Shang Junlin in surprise when she heard what Shang Junlin said. When she met his gaze, she immediately looked away. Whatever His Majesty said, it would be as long as it took. Anyway, the one waiting was not her young master. She could not be bothered to care what the emperor thought. After tidying himself up, Shun Yu followed Shang Junlin to the outer room. Mu Shi poured hot tea for them and left the room. Shang Junlin looked at Shun Yu and didn't say anything. Shun Yu said rascally, "Your Majesty, why did you come here at this hour? Is there something important?" Shun Yu's work and rest schedule was very regular. He never made life difficult for himself. After entering the palace, he also followed his previous habits. Shang Junlin was the only master in the palace. Shang Junlin had no objection to this, so the others didn't dare to have any objections. Shun Yu said that living in the palace was much more comfortable than living in Zhenbeihu's residence. Shang Junlin knew his work and rest habits. Usually, he wouldn't come here during his rest time. Oh, right. Most of the time, when he was taking a nap, Shang Junlin was still busy with official business. "How come today? It's almost time for the palace banquet. If you have any questions, you can ask me. It's your first time dealing with this kind of thing. It's normal that you're not familiar with it. Is your Majesty worried about me?" Shun Yu felt warm in his heart. "If not, your Majesty asked at the right time. There are some things that I don't quite understand." Shun Yu said something that shouldn't be known to people who didn't live in the palace. "Your Majesty, please enlighten me." Shang Junlin was in a good mood and answered one by one. Shun Yu thanked him with a smile. Shang Junlin was caught off guard by his smile. "Your Majesty, this year shouldn't be the day when the vassal kings return to the capital. Why did your Majesty call them back?" Shun Yu thought about this question for a few days, but he couldn't think of a reason. In his previous life, only the King of Yu returned to the capital. He found a reason to come back. "Your Majesty has entered the palace. Naturally, you have to meet with the royal family." Shun Yu was stunned. He thought of all the possible plans that Shang Junlin might have, But he didn't think that the reason would be like this. "TSK, I don't have a good relationship with the royal family. Your Majesty, you don't have to care too much about them. Just recognize them." When it came to these people who were supposed to be relatives and elders, Shang Junlin didn't have any feelings or respect. Shun Yu knew that Shang Junlin and the royal family didn't have a good relationship. He heard it from the King of Yu in his previous life. Shang Junlin was the only legitimate son of the Empress. He should have been appointed as the crown prince. He should have grown up smoothly and inherited the throne. Unfortunately, the late emperor wasn't clear-headed. He wanted to abolish the legitimate son and make way for the son of his favorite concubine. But in the end, Shang Junlin killed all the sons of the late emperor and his favorite concubine. He took the throne in a bloody way. The royal family had always been dissatisfied with this. In his previous life, the King of Yu took advantage of this to win over other royal families. He gave Shang Junlin a lot of trouble. Unfortunately, Shang Junlin was too strong. Their various actions in the early stage were like scratching an itch through a shoe. Only in the later stage did they really cause trouble for Shang Junlin. Who were the royal families? Shun Yu searched for a few names in his memory. It was a good opportunity to meet them at the palace banquet. The imperial edict asking the vassal kings to return to the capital had been sent to the fief of each of the vassal kings. There weren't many vassal kings left. Most of them were from the late emperor's generation. As for those who were of the same generation as Shang Junlin, most of them had been killed by him. The rest of them had to live with their tails between their legs and didn't dare to show their faces. When they received the imperial edict from the capital, Shang Junlin's brother's first reaction was fear. Was the emperor finally going to make a move on them? They were relieved when they learned that the emperor was only going back to attend the palace banquet. They didn't dare to delay. After receiving the imperial edict, they immediately ordered their subordinates to pack their luggage at the fastest speed and set foot on the road back to the capital. The King of Yu was the only one who was caught off guard by the emperor's news. He wanted to find an excuse to come to the capital, but he couldn't do it while he was still in the capital. The people who delivered the imperial edict were already on their way to his fief. The King of Yu had no choice but to put down what he was doing and rush back to his fief. He couldn't let the emperor know that he had secretly left his fief. Several fast horses died on the way back. He didn't rest for days and nights. Finally, he rushed back before the emperor's men entered his fief. He didn't have time to rest. After he cleaned up the traces of his departure, the people who delivered the imperial edict arrived. After receiving the imperial edict, the eunuch who delivered the imperial edict saw that the King of Yu didn't look well. He asked with concern, "Your Highness, are you feeling unwell?" "Thank you for your concern. I'm fine." The people behind the King of Yu passed a pouch to the eunuch who delivered the imperial edict. The eunuch calmly weighed the pouch and his expression became more amiable. He smiled and said, "Your Highness, please take care of yourself. I won't disturb your rest." After the people from the capital left, the King of Yu's legs went soft and he almost fell. The people behind him quickly supported him and said, "Your Highness." The King of Yu only felt that his vision turned black and he lost consciousness in the anxious voice of his subordinates. The King of Yu's residence was suddenly in a mess. The news was immediately passed to the hidden dragon guards who were mixed in with the imperial edict. Then, it was sent to Shang Junlin in an urgent and encrypted manner. The King of Yu didn't have time to rest. The emperor's imperial edict was so urgent that he had to leave for the capital immediately. His confidant was worried that he wouldn't be able to make it in time. Before the King of Yu woke up, he moved him onto the carriage back to the capital. The King of Yu woke up in the shaky carriage. After hearing his confidant's words, he was so angry that his chest hurt. The confidant lowered his head and prepared to endure the King of Yu's anger. The King of Yu was a person who cared a lot about his reputation. Now that he was in such a sorry state, he was going to be very angry. The King of Yu waved his hand weakly and said, "I know." He really didn't have any temper. He had never suffered so much in his life. However, he couldn't tell anyone about it. There was still a mess in the capital waiting for him to clean up. Just thinking about it gave him a headache. Shun Qingran also had a bad time recently. Not only did he break his leg, but he was also grounded by Count Shunbei. He couldn't find the person he liked. 2 days ago, that person had sent him a message, but there had been no news from her for the past 2 days. What Shun Qingran couldn't stand the most was that people kept talking about how Shun Yu was favored after entering the palace and what the emperor had done for him. Every time he thought about how close he was to becoming Shun Qingran's wife, Shun Qingran would go crazy with jealousy. Second young master hit a few more servants yesterday. The servants in the manor are becoming more and more unwilling to serve him. She put the plum blossoms she picked outside into a vase and said, she always felt that second young master was very fake. Every day, he would tell the servants that everyone was equal. He didn't ask for less servants to serve him. However, those short-sighted servants believed his words and liked to stay by his side more and more. Oh! Shun Yu raised his eyebrows. Hasn't he always disliked people who casually hit and scold servants? He's just pretending. She curled her lips and said disdainfully, it's just words. This servant has inquired before. The treatment in his courtyard is far worse than that of the servants by young master's side. I don't know what kind of magic potion those servants have been fed to think that he is better than young master. Shang Junlin was reading memorials on the side. When he heard this, he raised his head. They are short-sighted and have eyes but fail to see. In my opinion, the bastard son of Count Shunbei's family is far inferior to your young master. She nodded fiercely. Her fear of Shang Junlin had subsided. Recently, Shang Junlin liked to bring memorials to Yuzhong Palace to read. She was no longer as startled by him as before. Your Majesty, have you finished your work? Shun Yu walked over with a hand warmer. Shang Junlin had occupied the place where he originally used to read. The place was very comfortable, and Shun Yu could stay there for the whole afternoon. Seeing Shun Yu come over, Shang Junlin made room for him and complained half-truthfully, Your Majesty really doesn't care about me anymore. Your Majesty, what are you talking about? Shun Yu sat down unceremoniously and said sweet words. Your Majesty will always be irreplaceable in my heart. Your Majesty, take a look at this. Shang Junlin handed him a memorials. Shun Yu took it and looked at it silently. Then he silently returned it and stared at Shang Junlin without saying a word. It was a memorials to persuade the emperor to take a concubine. What does your Majesty think? Shang Junlin's expression didn't change. I have many of the same memorials here. Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading Website, mbk50. CC. Chapter 15. The palace servants kneeled down. No one expected that Shun Gui-jun, who had always been gentle and good-tempered, would suddenly say such words. They didn't dare to look up at the emperor's face, but they had heard about the emperor's temper. Shun Guijuan's words would definitely anger the emperor. What they couldn't figure out was why Shun Yu wanted to dig his own grave. The emperor doted on him, but since ancient times, how could there only be one beauty in the emperor's harem? Shun Yu not only showed his jealousy, but also used threats. Wasn't he cutting off his own path of retreat? Mushi's forehead was covered with a layer of fine sweat. She restrained the fear in her heart and looked up. Unfortunately, from her angle, she could only see her son's face and not the emperor's expression. In the oppressive silence, Eunuch Meng carefully looked at the emperor's face. Suddenly, his heart jumped. The emperor didn't look angry. When he looked at Shun Yu again, he still had a smile on his face. Only his pitch-black eyes gave off a bone-chilling coldness. Eunuch Meng couldn't understand the Duke of Zhenbei's son. The two protagonists, who were silently watched, didn't care about the palace servants' thoughts. Shun Yu looked at the handsome emperor in front of him and said, Your Majesty, do you really want to accept a new person into the harem? How can my noble emperor be so jealous? Shang Junlin leaned close to Shun Yu's ear and said in a low voice with a hint of hint, If your noble emperor can use practical actions to dispel my thoughts, I will do as you say. The two didn't seem to be talking about the expansion of the emperor's harem, but something insignificant. Shun Yu lowered his eyes and glanced at the kneeling palace servants. His eyes lingered on a little eunuch for a while. When the eunuch realized something was wrong, he withdrew his eyes and said, "Your Majesty, do you really want to be here in front of these people?" Shang Junlin held Shun Yu's waist and put him on his lap. He casually glanced at Eunuch Meng and said, "Meng Chang, take them out." Eunuch Meng didn't dare to disobey. He bowed his head and took all the palace servants away. After the palace servants left, Shun Yu loosened her grip on Shang Junlin's collar and wanted to get down from Shang Junlin's lap. Just as he moved, he felt the arm around his waist tighten. Shun Yu looked at Shang Junlin in confusion. His gaze seemed to say, "She's gone. Shouldn't you let go of me now?" Unexpectedly, not only did Shang Junlin not let go of her, he even pulled her into his arms and asked meaningfully, "Gui Jun, what do you think? Is your Majesty dissatisfied with my performance just now?" Shun Yu glared at him. Presumably, the whole capital will soon know that Shun Gui Jun, who just entered the palace, is not only jealous, but also threatened His Majesty not to accept new people into the palace. "Your Majesty, how do you plan to compensate me for the loss of my reputation?" Shang Junlin lifted Shun Yu's chin and looked at him deeply. "What kind of compensation do you want?" "I'm tired of looking at the treasures of Yuzhang Palace, Your Majesty. Your appetite is not small." Shang Junlin's words were not false. Yuzhang Palace was the most gorgeous palace except for a few main palaces. There were many rare treasures used for decoration. In terms of magnificence, it was even better than the emperor's bedroom. After Shen Yu became the master of the Jade Gate Palace, the emperor's rewards were even more endless. Which one of them wasn't a precious item? Shen Yu, on the other hand, lightly said that he was tired of looking at them, and Shang Junlin had to send him a new batch. "Your Majesty is too kind." Shen Yu took Shang Junlin's words as a compliment. His eyebrows curved, and his index finger tapped the man's shoulder. "When does Your Majesty plan to let me go?" Shang Junlin had one hand on Shen Yu's waist and the other hand pinched his chin. Hearing this, Shang Junlin let go of his hand, and Shen Yu slowly moved away from the man. This time, he did not encounter any obstacles. Shen Yu turned back. Shang Junlin had already started reading the memorials again. Other than suddenly stopping him, there was nothing strange. Shen Yu shook off the various thoughts in his mind and picked up the royal family genealogy that Shang Junlin had sent over. The royal family, especially Shang Junlin's generation, did not have a large population. Other than the King of Yu, the other members of the royal family were very well behaved. Even the King of Yu did not dare to show any ambition at this stage. Shang Junlin rested in Yuzhang Palace for the night. The next morning, he sent a large number of rewards to Yuzhang Palace under the pretext of appeasing noble Lord Yu Sai. Eunuch Meng personally came to announce the decree. Everyone in Yuzhang Palace, who had been worried all night, was finally relieved. Mu Shi chose items that Shen Yu liked from the storeroom and rearranged Yuzhang Palace. Shen Yu held a novel and read it outside while sunbathing. Imperial physician Ji Yu, whom he had not seen for many days, came to see him. Mu Shi knew that his master paid attention to Imperial physician Ji Yu, so he personally brought him over. "I haven't seen you for many days. Is Imperial physician Ji Yu well?" Shun Yu raised his head from the novel and asked in a lazy voice. Imperial physician Ji Yu knelt down and saluted. "This official thanks noble lord for saving my life." "Imperial physician Ji Yu, what are you talking about? I have been staying in Yuzhang Palace all this time. How can I bear Imperial physician Gu's saving grace?" Shun Yu tilted his head. "Imperial physician Ji Yu, please rise." Shun Yu's life-saving grace was not something that could be ignored just because he refused to admit it. Imperial physician Ji Yu also knew that there were many eyes in the palace. He listened to Shun Yu and stood up. "Please extend your hand. This official will take your pulse." Imperial physician Ji Yu stretched out his snow-white wrist from the wide sleeve. He looked straight at Shun Yu and finished taking his pulse. "Your pulse is stable. You can change to the next nursing prescription." "Thank you, Imperial physician Ji Yu. This is this official's duty." If it was Imperial physician Gu's duty to nurse Shun Yu's body in the past as a doctor, from now on, there was an unspeakable kindness. Imperial physician Ji Yu became more and more concerned about Shun Yu's physical condition. Imperial physician Ji Yu really appreciated Shun Yu's kindness. If Shun Yu had not announced that he was not allowed to treat other people, he would not have been able to help when those people came to beg for help. He would have lost his life for nothing. He escaped a disaster because of Shun Yu's words. No matter what purpose Shun Yu had for saying those words, it could not change the fact that had happened. According to His Majesty's attitude towards those people, if he really got involved in this matter, he was afraid that it would be difficult to escape being held accountable. If it was light, he would lose his official position. If it was heavy, he would lose his life. When Imperial Physician Ji Yu left, he couldn't help but think, did Shen Gui-jun realize something when he said those words? When he returned to the Imperial Hospital, his familiar colleagues came to greet him. Imperial Physician Ji Yu had always been very popular. Soon, many people gathered around him. Several people walked inside while discussing medical skills. Suddenly, there was a low voice of discussion not far away. This Shen Gui-jun is so beautiful that His Majesty promised that he would not accept any new people. More than that, I heard that he even threatened that he would kill as many people as they entered the palace. This is too. Does His Majesty let him do as he pleases? He is now favored. What does His Majesty not want? I heard that in order to appease this noble, His Majesty rewarded a lot of things to Yuzhong Palace. But he is just a man. He can't have children. Will His Majesty not have any descendants for his whole life because of him? Count Shunbei really made a profit by sending a charming legitimate son into the palace. In the future, he will have everything he wants. Imperial Physician Ji Yu suddenly stopped. The person who was discussing a pathology with him was surprised. What's wrong? Please wait for me. After that, regardless of the doubtful expressions of his colleagues, he walked towards the group of people who were talking. The people who were left behind looked at each other. What's going on? I don't know. Let's go and have a look. Who allowed you to talk about the royal family's affairs? Imperial Physician Ji Yu said coldly. The people who were talking excitedly suddenly stopped and lowered their heads guiltily. I know I was wrong. They were all small officials of the Imperial Hospital. Imperial Physician Ji Yu was their immediate superior. Naturally, they did not want to offend him. Imperial Physician Ji Yu wrote down their identities. Next time, don't let me hear you talk about these things. It was indeed inappropriate to talk about the royal family's private affairs. They nodded. The colleagues who followed Imperial Physician Ji Yu became more and more confused. When did Imperial Physician Ji Yu care about these trivial matters? After this incident, the world once again refreshed the degree of favor Shen Yu had. His Majesty was willing to empty the harem for him. It could be seen how deep his love was. Those ministers who wanted to send people to the harem had to give up the idea. His Majesty's attitude was already very obvious. If they really wanted to send people to the harem, there would be no more people sent in less than a day. Especially those who wanted to send their children to the harem, they no longer dared to say anything. They wanted people to enter the harem to fight for favor and give back to their families, not to send people to die. In the morning, the emperor expressed his attitude that he would not accept new people. After the morning court, Duke Shunbei walked out in a trance under the envious and jealous eyes of the ministers. Duke, someone approached. Duke Shunbei really taught a good son. Several people gathered around. Duke Shunbei, you have to persuade your noble son. As the emperor's people, how can he be so jealous? Yes, now His Majesty likes him, but if one day, Duke Shunbei was annoyed, his face became cold, don't put on a good attitude for my son. If you have the ability, then let His Majesty only favor your daughter. After that, regardless of the face of the people who were insulted, he turned around and left. If it was in the past, he would be ecstatic that Shen Yu was so favored, but now he was not sure about Shen Yu's attitude towards the Duke Shunbei's mansion. Speaking of hostility towards the Duke Shunbei's mansion, other than Shen Qingran and his son, he did not do anything else. I have to find a time to test his attitude towards the Duke Shunbei's mansion, Duke Shunbei secretly decided. After the morning court, Shang Junlin went directly to Yuzhong Palace, followed by eunuch Meng, followed by two little eunuchs who were holding memorials. Since that day, His Majesty seemed to want to compensate Shen Gui-jun. Every day, except for the morning court, he would stay in Yuzhong Palace most of the time. Shun Yu was tending to a pot of light green flowers and plants. The branches and leaves were sharp, only half the height of a palm. It was planted in a white porcelain pot with light blue patterns. "This grass grows very well," Mu Shi said. "It has a name, it's called Junling." Shun Yu took the handkerchief Mu Shi handed over. "It grows well, it should be able to survive this winter. Imperial physician Ji Yu said that it can help sleep, is that true?" Mu Shi was skeptical. No matter how she looked at it, it was an ordinary grass, except that its color was more tender than ordinary grass. Since Imperial physician Ji Yu sent it here, it must be effective. Shun Yu looked at it for a while, then poured some water on it. "Did you find out what happened to Imperial physician Ji Yu?" Imperial physician Gu's case involved the most sensitive topic at present. Whether it was Shun Yu or Imperial physician Ji Yu himself, it was not convenient for them to talk about it to outsiders. Shun Yu still did not know why Imperial physician Ji Yu was involved in the case and even lost his life because of it in his previous life. "This servant." Mu Shi was about to answer when she was interrupted by a man who suddenly entered the door. Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading Website, mbk50. cc. Chapter 16. It was not the first time that Mu Shi was interrupted by the Emperor when he was talking to Shun Yu. Compared to his initial fear, he was now much calmer. Eunuch Meng, who came in behind Shang Junlin, ordered the palace servants to put down the booklets and took the lead to retreat. The palace servants also retreated one by one. In the blink of an eye, only Shun Yu and Shang Junlin were left in the room. Shun Yu looked at the empty room and walked to Shang Junlin. He raised his head and asked, "Will your Majesty tell me?" Shang Junlin looked at him calmly. "If your Majesty asks, I will tell you." "Does your Majesty really know?" Shun Yu was stunned. He thought that Shang Junlin said it deliberately. Imperial physician Ji Yu was just an imperial physician. If he was not involved in Censor Zhong's case, Shang Junlin should not have spent so much effort to investigate him. Or was Imperial physician Ji Yu also involved in this matter in this life, but for some reason, he did not cause the same tragic consequences as in his previous life? The doubt in Shun Yu's eyes was too obvious. Shang Junlin frowned. "What is your Majesty thinking?" "I'm wondering why your Majesty pays special attention to Imperial physician Ji Yu." Shun Yu blurted out. After he finished speaking, he realized that something was wrong and quickly remedied. "No, I'm just curious why your Majesty knows so much about Imperial physician Ji Yu." Shun Yu's voice became fainter and fainter. Shang Junlin was so angry that he laughed. The inexplicable feeling in his heart just now was swept away. "Then why does your Majesty think that I pay special attention to Imperial physician Ji Yu?" Shang Junlin emphasized the word special. "No matter what reason your Majesty pays special attention to Imperial physician Ji Yu, if it's because of some other reason, your Majesty should not think about it." Shun Yu looked at Shang Junlin's eyes with a burning gaze. What other reason could there be? Shang Junlin was about to ask, but he heard Shun Yu's next words. "Your Majesty promised me that no new people will enter the harem." Shang Junlin asked incredulously, "Why do you think I have such thoughts? Otherwise, why would your Majesty pay attention to Imperial physician Ji Yu?" Shun Yu calmly threw the question back. "What else could it be? Of course, it's because of you." Shang Junlin suddenly reacted. He stroked Shun Yu's neck and squeezed it with a sense of oppression. "Shun Gui-jun, you're quite bold. You're trying to trick me." Shun Yu didn't dodge. He lowered his eyes slightly and said, "I'm just a little worried. After all, I only have your Majesty in this world." Shun Yu, Shang Junlin caressed the skin on Shun Yu's neck. Suddenly, he forcefully pinched Shun Yu's chin, forcing him to raise his head. "Don't play any tricks in front of me." "Why would your Majesty think so?" Shun Yu suddenly smiled. His eyes seemed to be full of light. "I'm your Majesty's man now. Isn't it normal to be worried that your Majesty has another woman?" "Your Majesty," Shun Yu covered the man's hand, "your Majesty's words are like gold. I'll take your words seriously." Shang Junlin's heart jumped. He let go of his hand as if he was scalded. He slightly averted his gaze. "Of course, my words are like gold." Shun Yu knew when to stop. He took back his hand and returned to his usual gentle appearance. Your Majesty, can you tell me about Imperial Physician Gu? After all, after Imperial Physician Gu's treatment, my body is indeed much better than before. The following words were an explanation of why he cared about Imperial Physician Gu. I found that someone from that side had looked for Imperial Physician Gu. That's why I sent people to investigate. Shang Junlin looked deeply at Shen Yu. I'm curious. Why is your Majesty so sure that Imperial Physician Gu would be involved in Censor Zhong's case? No matter how good Imperial Physician Gu's medical skills were, he was just an Imperial physician without much power. Those who were involved in Censor Zhong's case were basically court officials. Logically, it shouldn't have much to do with an Imperial physician. Why did Shen Yu think that Imperial Physician Gu would be involved in this matter? This was what Shang Junlin couldn't figure out the most. Shen Yu didn't seem to feel Shang Junlin's probing. He leaned closer to Shang Junlin. Your Majesty, I'm a little cold. The man's body was very warm, like a big heater that could provide endless heat. This was also the reason why Shen Yu tacitly allowed Shang Junlin to stay in his bedroom. Shang Junlin looked around and found that the window had been blown open at some point. He used his internal strength to close the window and wrapped himself in a fox fur cloak. Are you feeling better? Shen Yu hugged the cloak and nodded. His body was weak, and Imperial Physician Gu also said that it was best not to let him catch a cold. Ordinary people could recover from a cold in a few days, but if Shen Yu caught a cold, it might take his life. Shang Junlin had seen him get sick once. He didn't know if it was because he was frightened or something else, but he specially ordered that the place where he stayed must be warm. Shen Yu was a person who would never treat himself unfairly. The living conditions in Yuzhong Palace were much more comfortable than other palaces. Sometimes, Shen Yu even suspected that Shang Junlin worked and rested here because it was more comfortable to live here. Shang Junlin saw that Shen Yu's face was pale, so he poured a cup of hot tea for him. In this world, only Shen Gui Jun can be served by me. Your Majesty is so nice. Shen Yu took a few sips and felt his body temperature rise. His eyebrows relaxed. Your Majesty hasn't told me about Imperial Physician Gu. Shen Yu held the cup and looked at the man. Shang Junlin didn't expect that Shen Yu was still thinking about Imperial Physician Gu when he was not feeling well. He didn't care about other things and helplessly told him about it. He is a chess piece that the Zhong family buried in the palace many years ago. They wanted to use Imperial Physician Gu to spread the news outside the palace. If you didn't arrogantly ask Imperial Physician Gu to only treat you, Imperial Physician Gu would have fallen into the trap that was specially made for him the day after you said those words. Shang Junlin looked at Shen Yu meaningfully. Imperial Physician Gu's medical skills are paramount. If you didn't say it, he would definitely help others if they came to him. After you said it, he really declined the invitation to treat them. He listened to you. Isn't this borrowing His Majesty's power? If it weren't for His Majesty's favor to me, Imperial Physician Gu wouldn't listen to me. Shen Yu knew better than anyone that if his identity wasn't Shen Gui Jun, and if he didn't give a suitable reason, Imperial Physician Gu wouldn't listen to him. You can say anything. Shang Junlin shook his head. This is good. With this favor, Imperial Physician Gu will only pay more attention to your illness. After I met Your Majesty, everything became better. Your Majesty is my lucky star. According to what you said, you are my lucky star. If it weren't for you, Imperial Physician Zhong's case wouldn't have progressed so smoothly. After Imperial Physician Zhong's crimes were announced, the forces that opposed Shang Junlin in court were extinguished. When the 15-day deadline was up, official Fang had just finished the trial of Imperial Physician Zhong's case. The officials involved were all imprisoned one by one and sentenced according to the severity of their crimes. As the mastermind, the Zhong family was sentenced to 9 generations of extermination, and Imperial Physician Zhong himself was killed. There were many other officials who were convicted. Shang Junlin acted quickly and used this case to uproot Imperial Physician Zhong's influence in court. The pawn that the Zhong family left in the palace was a concubine of the previous emperor. She was young, had no children, and had no connection to the Zhong family. She had always kept a low profile. Otherwise, She wouldn't have been able to escape from the purge when Shang Junlin ascended the throne. After Shang Junlin ascended the throne, he allowed the concubines of the previous emperor to leave. Those who didn't want to leave lived in a remote palace. Most of these people didn't have prominent backgrounds, so they didn't have a good place to go. At least they didn't have to worry about food and drink in the palace. Is Beauty Shu really a member of the Zhong family? Shen Yu felt that it wasn't so simple. Shang Junlin frowned. She is too cautious. We only found that she had some connections with the Zhong family, but we couldn't find out who she was working for. Shen Yu was puzzled. His Majesty didn't ask anyone to interrogate her. She ate and lived with those people. If she disappeared for no reason, it would definitely arouse the vigilance of the people behind the scenes, Shang Junlin explained. Shen Yu, does your Majesty usually see those people? Shang Junlin, occasionally, but I didn't put them under house arrest. Shen Yu, other than the palace where they live, where else would they usually appear? Shang Junlin, why are you asking this? Shen Yu supported his chin and said, Your Majesty, if I say that I have a way for you to take them away for interrogation without arousing suspicion, but I just need your Majesty to cooperate, will your Majesty cooperate? Noticing Shang Junlin's puzzled gaze, Shen Yu leaned over to the man's ear and whispered a few words. Qin Garden was a place where the previous emperor liked to bring his concubines to play. After Shang Junlin ascended the throne, the harem was abandoned. Except for the previous emperor's concubines, very few people would come here. Not all those who stayed in the palace were resigned to their fate. There were a few beauties who were brought in by the previous emperor during the latter part of his reign. They wanted to rely on their beauty to fight for themselves. However, the new emperor was completely different from the previous emperor. He was a master who didn't get close to beauties. After a few bold ones were executed, the rest of them temporarily settled down. It wasn't until Shen Yu entered the palace that a few ambitious ones became restless. After dressing up, they went to Qin Garden together. This was the only place where they could meet the emperor by chance without being conspicuous. Today's weather was good and the sun was shining brightly. Shen Yu had been bored in the palace for a long time and wanted to go out for a walk. Shang Junlin had finished his official business and accompanied him. Today's weather is warm. Your Majesty, let's go to a few places that I haven't been to before. Seeing Shang Junlin nodding his head, Shen Yu turned his head and asked, Eunuch Meng, is there any place in the palace with good scenery? Eunuch Meng had been in the palace for a long time and was very familiar with the palace. He introduced one by one to Shen Yu, if you want to talk about beautiful scenery, Fang Garden is very good. However, the flowers planted there only bloom in summer. In winter, Qin Garden's scenery is the most beautiful. After listening to Eunuch Meng's introduction, Shen Yu chose to go to Qin Garden. Shen Yu and Shang Junlin whispered to each other. Eunuch Meng and his men followed them from a distance to avoid disturbing the two masters. Your Majesty, before Shen Yu could finish his words, a person suddenly bumped into him from the corner. Shang Junlin didn't have time to think. He grabbed Shen Yu's arm and pulled her into his arms. That person just happened to bump into Shang Junlin. The woman's eyes were covered with a white cloth. She grabbed Shang Junlin's clothes with one hand and pulled the white cloth off her face with the other. She said in a clear voice, I caught you. The rest of her words were swallowed when she saw the scene in front of her. The woman quickly let go and knelt down. Your Majesty, please forgive me. I didn't know it was Your Majesty. I didn't mean to offend you. She used the opportunity of playing hide and seek to bump into the emperor. There were too few opportunities to interact with the emperor. She didn't want to let go of any opportunity. Whether it was for herself or for that person's request, she had to get along with Shang Junlin. After a long time, the woman didn't hear any sound. She carefully raised her head and saw that the emperor didn't even look at her. He was gently tidying up Shen Yu's hair. When she looked at Shen Yu again, he was smiling and didn't seem angry. She immediately felt relieved. However, before she could breathe a sigh of relief, she saw the smiling Shen Guijun walk in front of her. Ah! Shen Yu seemed to be in a difficult position. It was this hand that touched Your Majesty. I don't like it when others touch my things. How about this, if you touched it, you can leave it there. How about that? Genius 1 second. Remember this website. www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading Website, mbk50. cc. Chapter 17. She looked at the young man standing in front of her in disbelief. The young man had a jade-like face and a spring breeze smile on his face, but that smile didn't reach his eyes. The young man's pupils were very dark, and the place where he stood blocked the light. His eyes were like a deep abyss. Fear crept up her spine. She clearly realized that the young man was serious about what he said. He would really fulfill his promise. How could he be so bold? Even in front of the emperor, he didn't hide his possessiveness. Since ancient times, which emperor could stand the person sleeping next to him with such a temper? Wasn't he afraid that the emperor would hate him? The woman looked at the emperor standing behind the young man with the last bit of hope. Her heart sank little by little. No wonder Shen Yu could be so unscrupulous. It turned out that he was indulged. Why aren't you talking? Are you dissatisfied with my treatment? Shen Yu's voice fell. The woman's face paled even more. She resisted the fear and said in a trembling voice, "This concubine doesn't dare." "I think you dare." Shen Yu narrowed his eyes and looked at the woman kneeling on the ground. Her face was like a lotus flower with a pair of lovely eyes. She had the innocence of a young girl and the charm of a mature woman. She was only in her 20s. No wonder she had such thoughts. Did something happen to Sister Ling? Why don't I see her? She just seemed to go that way. Why don't we go and see? The woman called out as she walked. Her voice came from afar. Shen Yu turned his head and looked at Shang Junlin. Seeing him nod, he knew that their target was in this group of people. Shen Yu slightly leaned to the side. When the women arrived, they could see the tall and straight figure of Shang Junlin. Everyone was stunned. They didn't have time to think about why the emperor suddenly appeared here. They quickly saluted. Those who had other thoughts took advantage of the salute to show their advantage. Shen Yu silently looked at these people and took in their movements. Finally, his eyes slowly fell on an inconspicuous woman. Compared to the others, this woman's appearance wasn't particularly outstanding. It was just that her appearance was very pleasing to the eye. She wore a light blue dress. Among the beautiful women, she was very inconspicuous. Lin Jilan was the woman who was implicated in Censor Zhong's case. Shang Junlin's attitude today was different from usual. Although he was still cold, he did not give off the feeling of being unapproachable. Those who were braver could not help but want to fight for themselves. Looking at the young emperor who was almost surrounded by beauties, Shen Yu's eyes gradually darkened. The woman who was kneeling on the ground looked at the scene in front of her in horror. Just now, she had accidentally bumped into the emperor and was almost killed by Shen Yu. Now, there were so many people fawning over the emperor, the woman couldn't help but start to regret. If she had known that Shen Yu was this crazy, she wouldn't have acted so rashly. "Your Majesty is really popular." A slightly playful voice sounded. The women looked in the direction of the voice and saw Shen Yu standing not far away, looking at them coldly. His heart skipped a beat. For some reason, an ominous premonition arose in his heart. "Your Highness, come to my side." Shang Junlin's eyes darkened. No one knew what he was thinking. Shen Yu walked over and stood beside the man. He tilted his head slightly. "Your Majesty, who are these people?" "They are the imperial concubines of the previous emperor." "So they are the imperial concubines of the previous emperor. Why are all of their eyes on your Majesty?" "Those who don't know would think that they are your Majesty's imperial concubines." The place where Shen Yu was originally standing happened to be covered. These women were so focused on the emperor that they didn't notice that in addition to the emperor, Shen Yu was also here. No one thought that Shen Yu would directly expose their thoughts. Their faces turned red and white. "Your Highness, this concubine is here to find Sister Ling." When one person spoke, the rest of the people seemed to have found their backbone and spoke one after another. Yes, we saw that Sister Ling didn't appear. We were worried about her, so." Shen Yu listened quietly for a while, then raised his chin and said with a smile, "You are looking for that person?" Following Shen Yu's line of sight, they saw the pale-faced woman kneeling on the ground. "I don't know what Sister Ling did wrong, It's nothing, Shun Yu said lightly. It's just that when I saw her fall into your Majesty's arms, I wasn't in a good mood. The people who originally wanted to speak for the woman to show their kindness shut their mouths. If it was for other reasons, they could still plead for leniency. If it was really as Shun Yu said, they would be stupid to plead for leniency. What are you doing? Didn't you hear what I just said? Shun Yu was half leaning on Shang Junlin's body. His eyes were half closed, and his voice was full of displeasure. Several little eunuchs heard this and approached the woman kneeling on the ground. Regardless of the woman's struggle, they grabbed her arm. Your Majesty, Your Highness, please spare my life. This concubine was insensible. This concubine didn't mean it. Please, Your Highness, please spare my life. The strong smell of blood spread, and the blood on the ground swam. The woman fell down holding her arm. She was in so much pain that she couldn't speak. This is the result of coveting someone who shouldn't be coveting. A slightly cold voice sounded. The women couldn't help but tremble. After witnessing such a scene with their own eyes, they didn't dare to have any other thoughts. Shun Yu's meaningful gaze swept over the women who were as honest as quails. According to the rules of the palace, how should they be dealt with? According to the severity of the case, they should be imprisoned or given white silk and poisoned wine. Eunuch Meng replied, Your Majesty, please spare my life. Your Highness, please spare my life. Of course, they knew how serious the consequences of failure were. However, riches and honor came from danger. Compared to wasting their lives in the harem without any hope, they would rather take a gamble. And that person had said that as long as they could succeed, they could have glory, splendor, wealth, fame, and power in the future. They could have whatever they wanted. The only thing they didn't expect was that Shun Yu would make a move. In the face of life and death, how could they care about anything else? They just wanted to live. Shun Yu didn't really want to kill them. He deliberately pretended to be relaxed. The people who were begging for mercy saw hope. We beg Your Highness to spare our lives. We promise that we will absolutely behave ourselves in the future. We won't come out to be an eyesore to Your Highness. Shun Yu pondered for a moment, then take them to Yuzhong Palace. When I've vented my anger, maybe I'll let you go. Everyone quickly thanked him. After bringing them back to Yuzhong Palace, Shun Yu locked them up in different places. The people who had just been greatly frightened didn't dare to have any objections. They followed Shun Yu's arrangement. Lin Jilan was secretly taken away by Shang Junlin's people. Except for Shun Yu himself, no one else in Yuzhong Palace knew about it. As Shun Yu thought, the people behind the scenes didn't find anything wrong at all. There was a rumor that Shun Yu didn't allow Shang Junlin to take concubines. Those who got the news thought that Shun Yu brought them back to Yuzhong Palace to better torture them. Shun Yu was too lazy to care about what others thought. After handing them over to Shang Junlin, he no longer cared about this matter. Among the people who were brought back, Lin Jilan was not the only one who had problems. If they didn't receive someone's order, why would they want to get close to Shang Junlin? Mu Shi brought the medicine. Young master, it's time to take the medicine. Shun Yu brought it over and drank it in one gulp. Mu Shi handed over a handkerchief. Young master, Count Shunbei wants to see you. Why does he suddenly want to see me? Shun Yu remembered that he had asked Mu Shi to arrange people to go to Count Shunbei's mansion. What's the situation in Count Shunbei's mansion now? After this servant sent people there, concubine Yu, who originally had a better relationship with Count Shunbei, somehow angered Count Shunbei and was grounded. Shun Qingran's application was also changed back to the treatment of a concubine's son. Now the mansion is managed by a concubine who doesn't get along with concubine Yu and her son. Mu Shi explained the current situation of Count Shunbei's mansion. After hearing it, Shun Yu said, Tell Count Shunbei that I will find time to see him. Yes. In the evening, Shang Junlin came over. Shun Yu told him about Count Shunbei. You want to go out of the palace? Shang Junlin frowned. After all, he is my father. It's not good to not see him. Shun Yu lowered his eyes. How come I didn't know that Your Highness and Count Shunbei have such a deep relationship? Shang Junlin raised his eyebrows. It's okay to fool others, but you used it to fool me, huh? Your Majesty, I haven't returned to the mansion for a long time. I miss the mansion, Your Highness doesn't have to pretend in front of me. Shang Junlin lifted his chin. I know how Your Highness used to live in Count Shunbei's mansion. I think that Your Highness wouldn't want to return to Count Shunbei's mansion no matter where you want to go, right? Actually, Shun Yu blinked and said slowly, I heard that Shen Qingran and her son, who have always flaunted their power in Count Shunbei's mansion, have been unlucky recently. I wanted to go and see the fun. It was a pity that he didn't see the two's unlucky faces with his own eyes. Wouldn't it be better if Your Highness was so frank earlier? Shang Junlin held Shun Yu's chin and shook it. Shun Yu reached out to free his chin. Did Your Majesty agree? Yes. Without waiting for Shun Yu to speak, Shang Junlin added, I'll go with you. Shun Yu didn't leave the palace just to go to Count Shunbei's mansion. Count Shunbei's mansion was just a side trip. If Shang Junlin went with him, he wouldn't be able to do what he wanted to do. He tactfully refused, Your Majesty, aren't you very busy recently? I don't want to waste Your Majesty's time. Your Highness doesn't want me to go with you. Shang Junlin narrowed his eyes and approached Shun Yu with a sense of oppression. Why? I'm very happy that Your Majesty can accompany me. How can I not be willing? Shun Yu reached out and put his hand on the man's shoulder. The faint smell of medicine filled the tip of his nose, mixed with a faint fragrance. Shang Junlin's eyes darkened, and he stepped back along with Shun Yu's strength. I'll let Meng Chang prepare to go to Count Shunbei's mansion. Your Highness, you should rest early. Shang Junlin went to wash up. Shun Yu stared at the bed curtain and was worried. He originally planned to meet with his subordinates, find a birthday gift for Shang Junlin, and then go to Count Shunbei's mansion to see what was going on. If he left the palace with Shang Junlin, he could only go to Count Shunbei's mansion. What are you thinking about? Shang Junlin came back with steam all over his body. I'm thinking about something, Shun Yu said in a low voice. Does Your Majesty have anything you want? Why are you asking this? Nothing, I'm just asking. Shun Yu didn't really expect to get an answer. He yawned and leaned toward the heat source. Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading URL, mbk50. cc. Chapter 18. Mushi, if you want to give someone a birthday gift, what should you give them? Shun Yu held a teacup and asked the maid who was tying up his hair. Is young master going to give Her Majesty a gift? Mushi thought for a moment. It seemed that the only person who could make Shun Yu ask this question recently was Her Majesty. Sort of. Shun Yu didn't deny it. But, young master, haven't you already made a list of gifts? After Mushi mentioned it, Shun Yu remembered that he did ask Mushi to handle the birthday gifts. Bring me the list of gifts. I'll take a look. Yes. Mushi finished her work and went to get the list of gifts in person. Young master, this is the preliminary list of gifts. Shun Yu took the list of gifts and looked through it from beginning to end. He couldn't find anything wrong with it, but he wanted to give something other than what was on the list. Shun Yu tapped the table regularly with his knuckles and skimmed through his memory one by one. He tentatively decided on a few items. He still needed to think about the specifics. Early the next morning, Shun Yu felt the warmth beside him and opened his eyes in confusion. Your Majesty. Shang Junlin was holding a booklet and reading it while leaning on the bed. You're awake. A low voice came from above. Shun Yu rubbed his ears. Your Majesty, aren't you going to court today? Usually, when he woke up, Shang Junlin would have already gone to court. If it wasn't for the fact that it was bright outside, Shun Yu would have thought that it was still very early. Today is a day off. Shang Junlin put down the booklet in his hand. Didn't you say that you were going to Count Bei's residence? Shun Yu's muddled mind gradually cleared. He sat up with the quilt in his arms. I almost forgot if Your Majesty didn't mention it. It was obvious that he didn't care about going to Count Bei's residence at all. Shang Junlin was speechless. I told you last night. Shun Yu recalled what had happened last night. It seemed that Shang Junlin had mentioned it, but he had been thinking about something else recently and had subconsciously ignored it. Seeing that Shun Yu had woken up, Shang Junlin called for someone to come in and serve him. After washing up, they changed into comfortable clothes. Shang Junlin did not wear the clothes that represented his status as an emperor. Instead, he chose a black robe that did not reveal his identity. Shen Yu wore a light-colored robe with a snow-white fox fur coat on the outside. Your Majesty, are you going to hide your identity and leave the palace? Shen Yu looked at the man who was dressed like an ordinary person, and his eyes lit up. Shang Junlin had an impeccable face with sword-like eyebrows and starry eyes. His facial features were sharp, and there was not a single part of him that was not perfect. Without the luxurious clothes that represented his status as an emperor, he looked even more youthful and handsome. Shen Yu could accept to stay in the harem and cooperate with Shang Junlin mainly because of Shang Junlin's face. The more he looked at Shang Junlin's face, the more he felt that Shang Junlin's face suited his aesthetic. Shang Junlin explained, "It is not convenient for me to leave the palace with my real identity." Shen Yu could understand. Although Censor Zhong's case was closed, there were still many suspicious points behind the scenes. In fact, there was no need for Shang Junlin to accompany him to the residence of Zhenbei at this time. The carriage drove out quietly from the side door. Shen Yu sat opposite Shang Junlin. "Your Majesty, there is no need to go to the residence of Zhenbei with me. Since I have promised you, how can I regret it?" Even in the not spacious carriage, Shang Junlin sat up straight. Although the carriage was not big, the decoration inside was very comfortable. Shen Yu sat on a thick blanket and hugged a heater in his hand, so he did not feel cold at all. The residents of Zhenbei had received the news that Shen Yu was coming back early in the morning. Everyone was prepared and waiting for Shen Yu's arrival. An inconspicuous carriage slowly approached. Zhenbei, who had received the news that Shen Yu's return this time was not to visit relatives, so there was no need to arrange a ceremonial carriage. Seeing that it was a small carriage, he did not dare to neglect it. After entering the courtyard, the carriage stopped. The first to get off was a tall man. Zhenbei, who was about to speak, but when he saw the man's face, he knelt down with a plop. "Don't make it public." Shang Junlin said coldly. "Yes." Zhenbei, who wiped the non-existent sweat on his forehead and stood up. His fear of Shang Junlin was deeply imprinted in his heart. Zhenbei, who had seen Shang Junlin's cruel side when he massacred the imperial court. Since then, his fear of Shang Junlin had never lessened. The curtain of the carriage was lifted, and a white hand stretched out from the carriage. Zhenbei, who widened his eyes and watched the emperor who made him afraid, gently carry the young man out of the carriage. "Father, why don't you feel happy to see me?" Zhenbei, who was in a trance, looked at Shen Yu and then at Shang Junlin. He wondered if he was blind. His Majesty not only accompanied Shen Yu back to the residence, but also carried him out of the carriage. Hearing Shen Yu's voice, Zhenbei, who twitched the corner of his mouth, "I'm just too surprised." It was not that he had not heard the news about how his son was favored in the palace, but hearing it was not as impactful as seeing it with his own eyes. Zhenbei, who tried his best to calm down and led them to the hall. With Shang Junlin present, Zhenbei, who did not ask Shen Yu what he thought of the Hu Fu. The three of them chatted in the hall for a while. Shen Yu was very bored, so he pulled Shang Junlin's sleeve and whispered, "Your Majesty, do you want to see the place where I lived since I was a child?" The three of them were not far away, so Zhenbei, who naturally heard it. He was about to scold him, but when he saw Shang Junlin's cold eyes, he swallowed the words he was about to say. Zhenbei, who suddenly realized that the emperor was still the same emperor. The unique accommodation was only for a specific person. "You're right. I'll take you two there." "No need." Shang Junlin stood up. Shen Yu also stood up and walked out with Shang Junlin. Zhenbei, who subconsciously wanted to follow them, but he was stopped by Eunuch Meng, who stayed behind. "Marquis, please wait." Eunuch Meng smiled, but his attitude was very firm. Eunuch Meng was the emperor's favorite person. Zhenbei, who knew that this was also the emperor's intention, so he did not dare to disobey. Looking at the backs of the two people leaving, Zhenbei, whose heart was filled with deep regret. If he had paid more attention to Shen Yu, he would not have to worry about the future of the Zhenbei Hu Fu. Perhaps knowing that Shen Yu was coming back, the small courtyard where Shen Yu lived was no different from when he left. Shen Yu walked around slowly with people and pointed to the frozen small pond. "In summer, the pond will be full of lotus flowers. They are very beautiful, And the lotus seeds are also very delicious. There are also lotus ponds in the palace. If you like them, I'll take you there to pick them in summer. Your Majesty, why are you so nice? The two of them talked for a while, and Shunyu lazily yawned. If you're sleepy, go to sleep. Shang Junlin frowned as he caught the young man who almost fell. Your Majesty, do you want to come together? Shunyu narrowed his eyes and raised his head to ask. Yes. The two of them rested for half an hour. Shunyu was full of energy and remembered that there was still one thing he had not done. I heard that my brother broke his leg. Your Majesty, do you think I should go and see him? Shunyu held his chin and looked slightly worried. If people who did not know the truth saw this, they would probably think that he was really worried about his brother's health. Shang Junlin was sitting at the table and was reading the story that Shunyu used to read. His wide sleeves were spread out on the table. When he heard Shunyu's words, he turned his head and looked over. His eyes were very dark, like a bottomless abyss. At this moment, his eyes were dyed with a warm color under the sunlight, giving people an illusion of deep affection. Didn't you come to see your brother? I hope you won't be disappointed when you see him. How can your Majesty think of me like this? Shunyu walked to the man's side and bent down slightly. He lowered his head and whispered in the man's ear, Your Majesty, I will be sad. Shang Junlin pulled Shunyu's wrist and pulled him into his arms. He lowered his head and said, If your brother's injury is not as serious as you think, I think you will be disappointed. Your Majesty really knows me. Shunyu blinked his eyes and said, Does your Majesty want to come together? Since your Majesty invited me, I will naturally be disrespectful. The Count of Zhonbei's residence was so big that the news of Shunyu's return could not be hidden. In just a few minutes, from the front courtyard to the back courtyard, everyone knew that Shunyu had returned. Count of Zhonbei did not have a wife, so the concubines were not qualified to welcome guests in the front hall. If it was Madame Yu in the past, she was barely qualified. Since Shunyu's incident, her status in the Count of Zhonbei's residence had plummeted. She was even worse than the other concubines. When she heard the news of Shunyu's return, she was visiting Shun Qingran in the side courtyard. After Shun Qingran broke his leg, he was ordered to recuperate by Count of Zhonbei. It was said that he was recuperating, but it was actually a disguised house arrest. The courtyard he lived in was also changed. Shun Qingran could not understand why things developed like this. It was clear that Shunyu was no longer in the Count of Zhonbei's residence, but he still had such a big impact on the Count of Zhonbei's residence. Mother, did he really return? Shun Qingran grabbed Madame Ayu's hand with a gloomy expression. Yes, but I heard that he came back in an ordinary carriage. It seems that the rumors outside are not true. Every time she heard the news of how Shunyu was favored in the palace, Madame Ayu's regret increased. If she had known earlier, she would not have pushed the opportunity to enter the palace to Shunyu. I knew that he would not have such a good life. Mother, what should we do now? You said before that you met a noble person, Ran. Madame Ayu firmly grabbed her son's hand. There are not many opportunities for us to seize now. You must seize this opportunity. Tell Mother, what is the identity of that noble person? How far have you two progressed? Hearing Madame Ayu's words, Shun Qingran's expression changed. For now, he could only guess that the person was a member of the imperial family. That person had never told him his true identity. As for the relationship between the two, thinking of the person that he could not contact recently, Shun Qingran's expression became more unsightly. Noticing Shun Qingran's unsightly expression, Madame Ayu had a bad premonition. She hesitantly opened her mouth. Ran. Mother, don't worry, Shun Qingran gritted his teeth. I will not let Shunyu have an easy time. I didn't expect that little brother Qingran would still think of me when he was sick. How touching. A teasing voice sounded. Shun Qingran and his mother looked up. They saw Shunyu and a man in black standing intimately together. The servant stood behind them, trembling. They did not know how long they had been there. Little brother, you should be careful of your other leg. Shunyu's voice carried a smile, but the malice in his tone was not concealed. Shunyu. Shun Qingran was so angry that his vision turned black. Looking at the intimate posture of the two people, he suddenly laughed. Does His Majesty know that you left the palace to meet your lover in private? Meet my lover in private. Shun Yu tilted his head. Are you referring to him? Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading Website, mbk50. cc. Chapter 19. The news of Shang Junlin coming to the residence of Count Bei was a secret. Count Bei knew that the emperor didn't want to make it public, so he didn't tell the residents about the emperor's visit. Shun Qingran and his mother only got the news that Shun Yu returned to the residence of Count Bei. It was impossible for them to think that the emperor would personally accompany Shun Yu back to the residence of Count Bei. In the residence of Count Bei, only a few people knew what the emperor looked like. Concubine Yu wasn't qualified to enter the palace, so she didn't see what the emperor looked like. Shang Junlin came to the residence of Count Bei for the first time, so the servants didn't know him. When they heard Shun Qingran's question, they couldn't help but look at him. Shun Qingran just blurted it out because he was angry, but he felt it was inappropriate after he said it. What he didn't expect was that after he said it, Shun Yu's actions became more unscrupulous. Regardless of everyone's strange look, Shun Yu hung himself on Shang Junlin. Shang Junlin subconsciously reached out to protect him. Shun Yu, how can you be so shameless? Concubine Yu put on the airs of an elder. Now that you've entered the palace, you're one of the emperor's people. How can you use the excuse of returning to the residence of Count Bei to have a private meeting with someone else? Even if you don't think for yourself, you have to think for the residence of Count Bei. If the emperor blames you, do you want to drag the entire residence of Count Bei down with you? It seemed to be a lesson for the younger generation, but in fact, every sentence contained strong malice. Concubine Yu dared to say this because she and Shun Qingran both knew that Shun Yu had a close friend before entering the palace. At first, Shun Yu resisted entering the palace because of this person. According to Shun Yu's crazy behavior before entering the palace, they didn't doubt that Shun Yu would have a private meeting with a lover. Maybe he had such an idea from the beginning. Otherwise, how could it explain why Shun Yu suddenly agreed to enter the palace? Concubine Yu thought that she had found a reasonable explanation, so she spoke more firmly. Shun Yu, it's not that I, as a concubine, want to scold you. You also know that you are only a concubine. Shun Yu's tone changed. It seems that you also know your identity. Otherwise, I would have thought that you, concubine Yu, had become the legal wife of Duke Bei. Shun Yu deliberately emphasized the word concubine with a strong sense of sarcasm. It was as if the concubine was holding her heaving chest and her eyes were red with anger. Shun Yu admired concubine Yu's expression with great interest for a while. He tilted his head and rubbed against Shang Junlin. Even if I'm not the lord personally conferred by His Majesty, I'm still the legitimate son of the Count of Junbei. How can a concubine call me by my name? Lin, don't you agree? Lin. It was the first time that Shang Junlin heard Shun Yu call him so intimately. His heart trembled. He lowered his eyes and his long eyelashes covered his eyes. His voice was low and gentle. Yes, she should respect you. The intimate scene of the two people acting as if there was no one else around provoked Shun Qingran. He grabbed the quilt and sat up. Are you here to laugh at me? Taking advantage of His Majesty's favor, you do whatever you want. I want to see what will happen to you when His Majesty finds out what you have done and blames you. You don't have to worry about that. If I really angered His Majesty because of this, His Majesty will be furious. Everyone in the Duke Bei's mansion will suffer with me. Instead of worrying about me, you should worry about yourself. Shun Yu. You did it on purpose, didn't you? That's right. You see, either you help me hide it from His Majesty, or we'll all be punished together, so that I won't be alone. Shun Yu played with the man's fingers and said casually, don't you care about him? Shun Qingran was shocked by Shun Yu's attitude. He turned his head and looked at the man who was acting intimately with Shun Yu. You know that he is His Majesty's man. Why do you disregard your future and get involved with him? Shang Junlin gave a short laugh and touched Shun Yu's feather-like long hair. He is still willing to be with me. I am already very satisfied. Aren't you afraid that your whole family will be punished because of him? Shun Qingran widened his eyes in disbelief. He couldn't believe that this man with an extraordinary temperament was actually a love-struck fool. As long as I can make him happy, I don't care what I do. Shang Junlin stared at the young man in front of him. His eyes were soft, as if he only had eyes for the young man. Shun Qingran was so shocked that he couldn't speak. Besides being shocked, he couldn't help but feel jealous. The person he liked didn't come to see him even once when he was sick. Even their messages were few and far between. Why could Shun Yu easily get the love of two outstanding men? Obviously, he was the one who had transmigrated. He should be the protagonist of this world. Are you envious of me? Oh, no, are you jealous of me? Shun Yu approached him step by step. His voice was soft but cold. Are you feeling very indignant? Do you feel that I robbed you of the opportunity to enter the palace? Are you thinking that if you were the one who entered the palace, everything I have now would be yours? I didn't. Shun Qingran couldn't help but shrink back. He rarely confronted Shun Yu face to face. The only 2 times Shun Yu had scared him. No, that's what you think. Shun Yu pinched his chin and forced him to look at him. Your eyes tell me that you are jealous of my identity as the legitimate son. You are jealous of the men I met. You are jealous of me. Shut up. Shun Qingran awkwardly turned his head and pushed Shun Yu away. Shun Yu's words were like an axe that cut through his hard disguise, revealing his embarrassing inner self. The dirty and unbearable thoughts in his heart were exposed under the sun. Shun Yu took back his hand and stepped back. Shun Qingran, how can you be so rude to the noble prince? Quickly apologize. Zhenbei who had rushed over after hearing the news, saw the scene before he entered the room. There's no need to apologize. Shun Yu walked to Shang Junlin's side, took the handkerchief from his hand and wiped his hand. What can he do to me lying there? Shun Qingran was angry, but he didn't dare to say anything. He didn't understand why his father, who had always doted on Shun Yu, was biased towards Shun Yu when it was obvious that it was Shun Yu who was in the wrong. Was it really like what Shun Yu said, that the entire Zhenbei Fu was covering for Shun Yu? Zhenbei looked at Shang Junlin awkwardly. Shang Junlin had accompanied Shun Yu back to the Fu with his identity concealed. Without his permission, Zhenbei didn't dare to reveal his identity. He could only ask, what happened? He said that I met my lover in private and ruined the family's reputation. Shun Yu began to count with his fingers. Sir Zhenbei's vision darkened. His Majesty was still here. Shun Qingran was seeking death by saying such words. If His Majesty blamed the Lord Protector's mansion for this. No, he couldn't let such a thing happen. Zhenbei didn't know what happened before he came. Looking at the situation in the room, it didn't seem like there was an irreparable conflict. There should still be a chance to save the situation. He suppressed his anger and said, Noble Prince, Qingran is still young and has been spoiled by me. He speaks without thinking. It's time to teach him a lesson. Shang Junlin stroked Shun Yu's long hair and said in a low voice. Zhenbei didn't expect Shang Junlin to suddenly speak. He was stunned and looked at him carefully. However, Shang Junlin didn't even look at him. Zhenbei couldn't tell what Shang Junlin's attitude was, so he could only agree. After watching enough, Shun Yu planned to leave. Before leaving, he looked back and smiled. Father, don't forget what you promised me before you left. Zhenbei was shocked. He remembered that Shun Yu was talking about Shun Qingran and his mother. Now that Shun Yu was favored, he certainly couldn't offend his son. No matter how many thoughts he had, he could only suppress them. I won't forget. After Shun Yu left, Zhenbei ignored the sad eyes of Shun Qingran and his mother. He learned what happened from the servant and left with a sullen face. Concubine Yu rushed over and grabbed the hem of his clothes. Master Rana really didn't mean it. He was confused by anger. Shun Yu, no, noble prince brazenly took another man for a private meeting in the Zhenbei Fu. He wanted to harm the whole Zhenbei Fu. Duke Zhenbei kicked him away. Are you stupid? You believe everything he says. Why don't you think about it? The palace is heavily guarded, and he returned to the Marquis mansion temporarily. How can he have time to communicate with the lover you are talking about? That person is. Concubine Yu looked up in disbelief. Zhenbei didn't have the patience to continue to argue with her, So he impatiently said, "It's what you think. It's already that person's mercy that he didn't punish you. This concubine really didn't know." Concubine Ayu's tone was absent-minded. "You and your son should reflect on yourself here. In the future, without my order, you can't step out of the courtyard." Originally, because Shen Qingran was smart and knew how to please him, Zhenbei who didn't mind taking care of his son. But now, Shun Yu, who was favored by the emperor, was in front of him. He had to temporarily give up Shen Qingran. He had to find a way to find out His Majesty's attitude and whether this matter had a bad impression of the Zhenbei who fu. If there was, Shen Qingran and his son couldn't be left alive. Zhenbei who didn't find a chance to sound out Shen Yu and Shang Junlin's words. Without a summons, he didn't dare to approach them directly. He waited and waited until he heard that the two of them had returned to the palace. He didn't know if it was because Shun Yu had stayed outside for too long, but he faintly showed signs of fever. After returning to the palace, Shang Junlin immediately called for the imperial physician. After Shun Yu drank a bowl of warm medicine, he finally relaxed. "Take care of your own body." Shang Junlin frowned and looked at Shun Yu. When they were in the palace, Shun Yu didn't have many chances to catch a cold because he kept himself warm. He didn't expect that he would almost fall ill after leaving the palace for less than half a day. Shang Junlin realized for the first time how fragile Shun Yu's body was. Shun Yu smiled and moved closer to the man. He pressed down on his hand that was holding the pen to write the memorial. "Don't we have His Majesty? I can't watch over you all the time. If your Majesty doesn't watch over me, who else would you watch over?" Shun Yu sat on the small table where Shang Junlin put the memorial and looked down at Shang Junlin. "What nonsense are you talking about? Who else would I watch over other than you?" Shang Junlin picked up the long hair that fell in front of him. "Are you happy today?" Shun Yu tilted his head and smiled. "Of course I'm happy when I'm with your Majesty." Although some things didn't work out, Shun Yu was really happy when he saw Shen Qingran and his mother's unlucky appearance. "I don't think you're happy because I'm with you." Your Majesty saw through it but didn't say it out loud. Shun Yu's eyebrows curved. "Then, are you happy today? And, how does your Majesty feel when you're regarded as my secret lover who met outside the palace?" Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading URL, mbk50. cc. Chapter 20. Could it be that you have other lovers besides me? Shang Junlin grabbed the young man's arm and leaned closer to him. "Of course not." Shun Yu rolled his eyes. "In this world, who can be better than your Majesty?" Shang Junlin suddenly remembered the secret report from the hidden dragon guards before Shun Yu entered the palace. Shang Junlin's eyes darkened. "Don't lie to me. Your Majesty should have confidence in yourself. Otherwise, you should have confidence in my eyesight. Why would I give up your Majesty's Dragon Ball and choose the fish eye?" Shun Yu raised the corners of his lips. "My eyesight is good. Your Majesty really has good vision. You can even see that someone is trying to break into the prison." Shang Junlin's tone was calm as if he just said it casually. Shun Yu wasn't stupid enough to think that Shang Junlin was praising him. He knew that he couldn't get away with it so easily. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind, but he didn't show it on his face. It was as if he didn't understand the hidden meaning in Shang Junlin's words. Shun Yu tilted his head. "Those people are sneaky. It's obvious that they have ulterior motives. If your Majesty was the one who found them, your Majesty would definitely know that they have ulterior motives." Shang Junlin looked at Shun Yu meaningfully. There was a slight smile in his eyes. "Your Majesty is right. Your Majesty, did you catch the mastermind of the prison break?" Shun Yu was interested when he mentioned this matter. The result of the prison break was announced to the public that the mastermind of the prison break was someone from the Zhong family. The entire Zhong family was convicted. Some were beheaded, and some were exiled. With the fall of the Zhong family, the case of Censor Zhong also came to an end. But Shun Yu was well aware that the person who broke into the prison was He Gongzi, not Censor Zhong. The mastermind behind the scenes was naturally not someone from the Zhong family. It was very likely that it was Prince Yu. He just didn't know if Shang Junlin found out that it was Prince Yu. Your Majesty is so smart. Why don't you guess who wanted to break into the prison? His Majesty didn't even give me a hint. How could I guess? Shun Yu complained. Does Your Highness know the identity of the person being kidnapped? Shang Junlin asked. I don't know. Shun Yu shook his head. Even if he knew, he couldn't admit it at this time. That man is called He Jinyuan. Shang Junlin stared at Shun Yu's face as he spoke, not missing any change in his expression. He always felt that this matter was too coincidental. It was so coincidental that it didn't seem like a coincidence at all. He didn't know what role Shun Yu played in this matter. Looking at the young man's clear eyes, Shang Junlin hoped that he really had nothing to do with the prison break. Shun Yu allowed Shang Junlin to look at him. His expression did not change at all. He knew about young Master He because of his previous life, so he was not afraid that Shang Junlin would investigate him. No matter how powerful the hidden dragon guards were, they would not be able to find out anything that had not happened. He Jinyuan? Does he have anything to do with the He family? Shun Yu frowned slightly. That's right. Shang Junlin did not notice anything unusual about Shun Yu. He looked away and nodded. He is the most capable person in the younger generation of the He family. He is also the one who the He family has high hopes for. He is the one who can lead the He family back to the top. Although the He family is in a declining state now, it was still in its golden age a few decades ago. In Da Huan, it could do whatever it wanted. If it wasn't for the fact that the late emperor didn't like the daughter of the He family and hated the He family because of her, the He family might still be in the imperial court now. A centipede dies but never falls down. Although the He family has declined for a few decades, its foundation is still there. The remaining power is enough for people to take risks. Under the candlelight, half of the man's face was hidden in the shadows. Shun Yu picked up the brush on the brush holder and spun it. The person who broke the prison was not from the He family. The He family is not that capable. Shang Junlin smiled and took the brush from Shun Yu's hand. If the He family had a capable person, they would not put all their hopes on He Jinyuan. Shang Junlin secretly imprisoned the young master of the He family partly because he wanted to fish out the hidden power of the He family. He did not expect the other party to be so calm and not take any action. Your Majesty, tell me quickly. Don't keep me in suspense. Shun Yu held his chin and urged. Do you think I am a storyteller? Shang Junlin was not angry. It is all thanks to your reminder. I sent people to investigate the vassals and found a lot of interesting things. So Your Majesty allowed the vassals to return to the capital early? Shun Yu suddenly understood. No wonder the development of this life was different from the previous one. In the previous life, Shang Junlin might not even know that the young master of the He family was rescued by the King of Yu. Shang Junlin did not deny it. Shun Yu thought, get the person in front of you and find a way to provoke him. He will more or less reveal his flaws. The day of the birthday banquet was approaching. The palace was getting busier and busier. The palace had arranged everything in advance. The banquet of the previous dynasty was mainly handled by the Ministry of Rites. Shun Yu went through the process and was busy with the palace banquet. The people around Shun Yu were so busy that their feet did not touch the ground. Shun Yu himself was not as idle as before. Several times when Imperial Physician Ji Yu came to check his pulse, he was busy. You still have to take care of yourself. Imperial Physician Gu's expression became serious after checking the pulse. Imperial Physician Ji Yu, is the young master's condition getting worse? She was scared and her face turned pale. A damaged body can't be healed overnight. You should pay more attention to it. Otherwise, it will be more difficult for you to survive the winter. Imperial Physician Ji Yu hinted. With the medicine prescribed by Imperial Physician Ji Yu, this winter is much easier than before. Shun Yu was telling the truth. His illness was caused by his mother's womb. He was especially afraid of the cold. It was fine when the weather was warm. However, when the weather was cold, Shun Yu's days were particularly difficult. It was as if he was wrapped in ice, from his soul to his body. The coldness was like gangrene attached to the bone. It followed him like a shadow. No matter how warm the room was, it was useless. Shun Yu had lived 2 lives and suffered from the cold in both of them. Only this winter was not as difficult as before. I have already read the ancient books. I will definitely find a way to cure you. Not long after, Shang Junlin found out about the news from Shun Yu's side. With a wave of his hand, he sent a few more experienced palace servants over to help. Eunuch Meng personally brought them over. His Majesty specially instructed that you should not be too tired. If you need anything, just instruct the servants to do it. His Majesty asked me to bring them here. You can use them as you wish. Shun Yu looked at them one by one. These newly sent people had all served in the palace for some time. They were mature and steady, and their ranks were not low. If one were to take them out, they would be more than qualified to be the steward of a palace. Shun Yu felt that Shang Junlin had probably packed up everyone who could be used and sent them over. He had to admit that these people were very capable. With their help, Shun Yu's work was greatly reduced. It was not until a few days later that Shun Yu found out that Imperial Physician Ji Yu had specially gone to Shang Junlin for his condition. Shun Yu rested his chin on his hand and looked at the man who was reading the reports. He asked, "So, His Majesty sent so many people here because of Imperial Physician Gu's instructions?" Shang Junlin's hands paused. His Majesty sent people here first before Imperial Physician Ji Yu went to find His Majesty, Eunuch Meng said with a smile. Normally, he would not dare to speak so casually. But now, he knew that the Emperor treated Shen Gui Jun very differently. It would not be a problem to speak well of His Majesty in front of Shen Gui Jun. As expected, Shang Junlin only glanced at Eunuch Meng and spat out 2 words, "You speak too much." "I spoke too much." Eunuch Meng bowed his head and admitted his mistake. He did not feel much fear. "What did you say about Eunuch Meng?" "If Eunuch Meng did not mention it, I would not know that His Majesty cares so much about me. Is there a problem with me caring about you?" Shang Junlin's expression was magnanimous. "No problem." Shen Yu originally wanted to tease him. Seeing that he did not take the bait, he did not continue. "His Majesty should also care more about me in the future. If you can always be as obedient as you are now, I will naturally always care about you." Hearing Shang Junlin's words, Eunuch Meng's mouth could not help but twitch. If Shen Gui Jun was obedient, then there was no one in the world who was not obedient. Shang Junlin's birthday came in the blink of an eye. Early in the morning, Shen Yu was dug out of the quilt by Shang Junlin, who had not yet left. Shen Yu rubbed his eyes. "Your Majesty? Didn't I tell you yesterday that you had to get up early today?" Shang Junlin ignored Shen Yu's struggle and wrapped him up with clothes. Shen Yu muttered, "Isn't it because your Majesty is too energetic and can cause too much trouble? Mushi, come and help your young master wash up." Without waiting for Shen Yu to say anything more, Shang Junlin interrupted him. Last night, it was Shen Yu who pulled him aside and talked about the national conditions of Dahuan for half the night. However, when it came from Shen Yu's mouth, it seemed like something had happened. Looking at the servants around them, they all lowered their heads and could not hide their shyness. Eunuch Meng also had an expression that said, "I understand. Your Majesty has worked hard." Shang Junlin opened his mouth and then closed it again. This kind of situation had happened more than once, and he could not explain it every time. Shang Junlin had already tidied himself up and stood aside to wait for Shen Yu to wash up. After washing his face, Shen Yu was finally completely awake. He looked around and saw that the servants around him glanced at him from time to time with obvious joy on their faces. Especially Eunuch Meng and Mu Shi, they were gratified but also distressed. Shen Yu touched his nose inexplicably. He walked to Shang Junlin's side, pulled on his sleeve, and asked in a low voice, "What's wrong with them?" Shang Junlin looked back. Under his gaze, the servants all lowered their heads and did not dare to show the slightest expression. "Don't you remember what you said?" Shang Junlin lowered his head and looked at him. Shen Yu carefully thought back and suddenly remembered what he said in front of the servants when he was unconscious. He lowered his head little by little. "Does your Majesty have nothing to say to me? I spoke carelessly. Your Majesty is a magnanimous person. Don't fuss over such a small matter with me." Shen Yu's voice became lower and lower. "If your Majesty cares, I'll go and say it. I'm too good at tormenting people, no need." Shang Junlin rubbed between his eyebrows. Go and change your clothes. Shang Junlin had a premonition that if Shen Yu explained, the servants' imaginations would run in an even more ridiculous direction. Shen Yu looked at him again. Seeing that he did not seem angry, he went behind the screen to change his clothes. Eunuch Meng walked slowly to Shang Junlin and lowered his voice to persuade him, Your Majesty's health is not good. Imperial physician Ji Yu also said that you need to restrain yourself when it comes to that matter. Moreover, you have to be busy today. You should be considerate of Your Majesty's health. Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Website, mbk50. CC. Chapter 21. Meng Chang, are you very free? Shang Junlin narrowed his eyes. I still have a lot of things to do. I'll go now. Eunuch Meng could understand. His Majesty was young and strong, and Shen Guijun was the only one in the harem. Shen Guijun couldn't bear all his energy. It was just that Shen Guijun had to suffer. Fortunately, Imperial Physician Gu's medical skills were excellent, so he didn't have to worry too much about Shen Guijun's health. Shen Yu changed his clothes and came out. Eunuch Meng was no longer in the room. He looked around the room but didn't see him. What are you looking for? Shang Junlin walked over and adjusted Shen Yu's hairpin. Shen Yu hadn't reached the age of 20 yet, so he usually didn't tie up his hair. Shen Yu himself didn't like to dress up too much, so he usually tied his hair up with a hair tie. Today, Shen Yu had his hair tied up, which was rare. With a jade hairpin inlaid with rubies, he looked more noble than usual. His whole person was shining brightly. Where's Eunuch Meng? Isn't he always by your side serving you? Shen Yu was wearing the clothes that represented his status as a noble. There was dignity in the luxurious clothes, so dazzling that people couldn't take their eyes off him. Shang Junlin quietly looked at him for a while before saying, I have something to tell him to do. Oh. Shen Yu didn't ask any more questions. Other than the day he entered the palace, this was the first time Shen Yu wore such complicated clothes. He straightened his sleeves. The clothes looked good, but it limited his movements. Your Majesty, do I look good today? Shen Yu approached Shang Junlin. His voice was as soft as water. Shang Junlin looked at that incomparably beautiful face and found it hard to say the words not good. Shen Yu waited for a long time, but Shang Junlin didn't answer. He deliberately made a sad expression. Sure enough, I don't look good. I'm so ugly that Your Majesty can't say anything. Not ugly, Guijun is very beautiful today. Not only today, but in Shang Junlin's eyes, Shen Yu was always so beautiful that it tugged at his heartstrings. Thinking that such a beautiful noble would soon be seen by the courtiers, Shang Junlin frowned slightly. He suddenly had the idea of placing Shen Yu in the harem and not letting anyone see her. Shang Junlin shook off the strange thought that suddenly popped up in his mind and said, You may leave when you're done. Shen Yu didn't know what Shang Junlin was thinking. He smiled and approached him, sighing in a low voice, Your Majesty is also very beautiful today. Only you would dare to describe us like this. Looking at Shu Li's face that was so close to him, Shang Junlin curled his fingers. Shen Yu, I'm just telling the truth. Your Majesty won't punish me for telling the truth, right? Shang Junlin, we see that you're very brave. Are you still afraid of being punished? This is Your Majesty's misconception. I'm very timid, just a little bit. Shen Yu stretched out his hand and used his thumb and index finger to make a small distance. Also, I'm most afraid of pain. Your Majesty, please don't let me feel pain in the future. This will depend on Guijun's performance. Shang Junlin looked at him meaningfully. Shen Yu pretended not to understand the meaning behind Shang Junlin's words and asked doubtfully, My performance is not good enough? Then Your Majesty, tell me, do you like someone who is coquettish, clingy, or cold? Shang Junlin couldn't help but imagine Shen Yu with different styles. His heart suddenly jumped and he interrupted Shen Yu, We like Guijun's type. What a coincidence. I also like my type. Shen Yu stopped talking about the previous topic. Seeing Shang Junlin's face change slightly, he added, Of course, I like Your Majesty the most. Shang Junlin's eyebrows softened at a speed visible to the naked eye. Eunuch Meng, who had finished his work, came back and heard this conversation. He couldn't help but shake his head. The relationship between His Majesty and Gui Jun was really deep. In the gorgeous hall, the courtiers and vassals had already taken their seats. The well-trained palace servants nimbly served plates of delicacies. There were 2 empty seats in the high seats. One was for the emperor, and the other was a little lower. It was prepared for Shen Yu. His Majesty hadn't arrived yet, so the people present were relatively relaxed. They gathered together and whispered. The content of the conversation was nothing more than the politics of the court, the relationship between the major families, and so on. What was different from the past was that today they had one more topic to talk about, and that was Shen Gui Jun. His Majesty really dotes on this Shen Gui Jun. Yes, now Yuzhong Palace is the most powerful family in the harem. It is said that not long ago, Shen Gui Jun, because of jealousy, captured several concubines left by the former emperor and tortured them in Yuzhong Palace. Is this true? His Majesty didn't do anything about it. When it happened, His Majesty was also there. That person was also bold. Under the pretext of playing hide-and-seek, she directly bumped into His Majesty's arms. Shen Gui Jun got angry on the spot and crippled the woman's hand that touched His Majesty. Be careful with your words. The person who spoke casually glanced in a certain direction and lowered his voice. I'm just telling you. It is said that Shen Gui Jun was very angry that night. His Majesty had to coax her for a long time to calm her down. This is impossible, right? Some people refuse to believe it. It's just a man. If His Majesty wants, he can have as many men as he wants. But His Majesty only likes Shen Gui Jun. At this time, a low-ranking official came over and whispered, "What about the former emperor's concubines who were taken away by Shen Gui Jun?" Of course, they are still locked up in Yuzhong Palace. If Shen Guijun's anger doesn't subside, she probably won't let them go. His Majesty is too. Some people couldn't stand it. In any case, they are the former emperor's people. Some people stood on Shen Yu's side. If they didn't have the idea first and were caught red-handed, Shen Gui Jun wouldn't be angry with them. The people who were talking about it didn't notice that not far from them, the man quietly crushed the cup in his hand. Your Majesty, Shen Gui Jun has arrived. The hall suddenly quieted down. Shang Junlin took Shen Yu to the high seat, and the ministers saluted. For many people, this was the first time they saw Shen Yu's appearance. At the moment when they saw her, some people found a reason for Shang Junlin's abnormal behavior. Such a beauty, if it were them, they would also be willing to treat her like a treasure. Shen Yu's beauty was flamboyant and gorgeous, like a flower in full bloom, which could be seen but not touched. Everyone, please rise. Shang Junlin held Shen Yu's hand, walked all the way to the place where Shen Yu should sit, and came to the highest place. Shen Yu raised her eyebrows in surprise, poked the man's arm, and asked in a low voice, "Your Majesty?" The ministers who got up also saw this scene, and they looked at each other and frowned. "Sitting with me, are you afraid?" Shang Junlin looked down at the young man beside him, and his eyes were obscure. Reason told him that he should let Shen Yu sit in the place where he should sit, but when he passed by that place, he didn't let go, but led the young man to the highest place. "I'm not afraid." Shen Yu tugged at the man's clothes, "As long as your Majesty doesn't mind me taking up space." Shang Junlin hooked up the corner of his mouth, and a faint smile appeared in his eyes. Seeing that Shen Yu was going to sit next to Shang Junlin, some ministers couldn't sit still. "Your Majesty, this is inappropriate." "Oh. Then tell me, what's inappropriate about it?" The smile in his eyes instantly disappeared, and the young emperor looked down at the minister who spoke. His expression was indiscernible. Obviously, it was just a very calm sentence, but the minister who was kneeling on the ground was frightened and sweated. He knew that he had angered His Majesty, but some rules must not be abolished. Gritting his teeth, he made up his mind and said, "Your Majesty, it's inappropriate for Gui Jun to sit next to your Majesty." Once the first sentence came out, the rest of the words were easy to say. Since ancient times, only the Empress, as the head of the harem, can stand next to your Majesty. No matter how much your Majesty favors Gui Jun, he is not the Empress, he can't. Feeling more and more oppressive, He gritted his teeth and said the last sentence, "He can't have the same treatment as the Empress." Shang Junlin's black eyes sank, ignoring the minister's words, and sat down with Shen Yu. "Your Majesty, according to Kang Daren's opinion, should I confer Gui Jun as the Empress today?" Shang Junlin stroked Shen Yu's wrist and said with a cold tone. Kang Daren never thought that the Emperor would rather confer Shen Yu as the Empress than let Shen Yu return to where he should be. The ministers and vassals who were watching were also surprised. For the first time, they felt that the rumor about how much the Emperor doted on Shen Gui Jun was not a rumor. No one dared to stand up when the Emperor was angry. If it was something else, they could argue. But this was related to Shen Gui Jun. Who knows if the Emperor would directly confer her as the Empress if they stood up. Seeing that no one spoke for him, Kang Daren pointed his spear at Shen Yu. "Gui Jun, since you have entered the palace, you should scrupulously abide by your duty, be magnanimous and virtuous, and persuade His Majesty to have more children." Feeling that Shang Junlin's cold aura was getting stronger and stronger, Shen Yu knew that Kang Daren had really angered Shang Junlin this time. Shen Yu pressed the back of Shang Junlin's hand and signaled him not to speak. He stood up from Shang Junlin's arms and looked at Kang Daren condescendingly. "Does Kang Daren live by the sea? Why do you care so much?" Shen Yu slightly lowered his eyes and said with a somewhat careless tone. Kang Daren's face turned red. "You, Kang Daren, did you make a mistake?" Shen Yu was too lazy to listen to his words and interrupted. "This world is His Majesty's world. Kang Daren, as the imperial censor, it is your duty to persuade His Majesty, but it depends on what you are persuading. I also want to ask Kang Daren, where I sit, does it have anything to do with the state affairs?" Kang Daren couldn't answer. Of course, he knew that it didn't matter. He was just using this as a pretext to make a fuss. "As for the issue of having children, you should all know my attitude. I can't tolerate sand in my eyes and I am also very domineering. Since His Majesty has me, he can't have anyone else. You are simply unreasonable." Seeing that Shen Yu was stubborn, the man turned to Duke Bei and said, "Duke Bei, is this the good son you taught?" One Duke Bei, who had already experienced Shen Yu's power, didn't want to talk to him at all. "Your Majesty, Shen Gui Jun has only been in the palace for a few days, but he is already so lawless. You can't let him do everything. In the future, maybe." Shen Yu narrowed his eyes and looked at the middle-aged man who was panting heavily. This man was Shang Junlin's uncle. Because he had contributed a little to Shang Junlin's ascension to the throne, he had always boasted that he had contributed to the ascension of the emperor and was the most capable person in the royal family. If Shen Yu remembered correctly, this man had an unmarried niece who was a popular candidate to be the empress. No wonder he couldn't sit still after hearing Shang Junlin's words. "Prince Li, be careful with your words." Shang Junlin lightly interrupted Prince Li. He stood up and put one arm around Shen Yu's waist. His black eyes looked down emotionlessly. "Gui Jun is my man. How I pamper him is my business. It has nothing to do with you. Do you understand?" Shen Yu leaned into the man's arms, the corners of her mouth slightly raised, but the words she said sent chills down one's spine. Genius. 1 second. Remember this website. www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading Website, mbk50. CC. Chapter 22. Too arrogant. That was everyone's first thought. No one expected that Shen Yu would say such a thing in public. If he said it to the emperor in private, it could barely be considered a joke. But now, no one dared to treat Shen Yu's words as a joke. Gui Jun is joking. His Majesty is the emperor of a country. How can there only be one man in the harem? The speaker deliberately emphasized the word man. He was reminding Shen Yu that he was just a man and couldn't bear the glory of monopolizing the emperor's favor. "Daren, no matter how much you say, you can't ignore His Majesty's wishes, right? In the end, this is His Majesty's private matter. His Majesty can do whatever he wants. If I said that you should dismiss all your wives and concubines at home and give you a few that you don't like, you wouldn't be happy, right? You are twisting words and forcing logic. His Majesty is the emperor of a country. How can he be compared to us? The emperor of a country is a person. You are also a person. If you don't want to give people to you, how can His Majesty be happy? Shun Yu nestled in Shang Junlin's arms and felt the man's chest tremble. Her hand was also held by the man. Gui Jun is right. My private matter doesn't need to trouble my beloved ministers. Everyone could hear the joy in Shang Junlin's words. A crisis had been resolved. It was reasonable to say that the ministers should be happy. But the development of the situation didn't make them happy. The emperor favored only one person. For them, it wasn't a good thing. Some people began to secretly regret. If they had known that His Majesty wasn't tempted, they wouldn't have encouraged the son of Zhenbei Hu to enter the palace. Or, they should have recommended their children to enter the palace from the beginning. Compared to the endless glory and wealth, what was a little bit of danger? After that, during the palace banquet, no one dared to say anything about Shun Yu. The emperor's attitude was very clear. If they continued to talk about this matter, they didn't know how to appreciate favors. After a short period of low pressure, the palace banquet became lively again. Graceful dancers walked over with graceful steps, dancing gracefully to the moving music. Their gauze fluttered with their movements, creating an extreme visual feast. The dancers raised in the palace are indeed different. Shun Yu poked the meat in the bowl and sighed. You like it? Shang Junlin asked in an ambiguous tone. Shun Yu was keenly aware of Shang Junlin's displeasure. Although he did not know the reason, he still answered cautiously, that's not true. Compared to them, I still prefer Your Majesty. Millimeter. Shang Junlin was in a better mood and returned the favor, I also like you more. Seeing that the human pressure around him had returned to normal, Shun Yu continued to enjoy the song and dance. He had a lot of patience for beautiful things. While watching, he asked Shang Junlin, Your Majesty, do you know who arranged this dance? Shang Junlin did not care about these things. He summoned Eunuch Meng and said, answer your question. It was arranged by the music department. If you like it, I can ask them to arrange more. Eunuch Meng assisted Shang Junlin in managing the palace, so he was very clear about these trivial matters. Meng Chang. Hearing Shang Junlin's emotionless voice, Eunuch Meng knew that things were not good. He was so focused on pleasing the emperor that he forgot that His Majesty would be jealous because of this. Shun Yu acted as if he did not feel anything. He tugged at Shang Junlin's sleeve and asked softly, Your Majesty, can you accompany me to watch it? Shang Junlin's displeasure disappeared instantly. He glanced at Eunuch Meng and said, didn't you hear what the emperor said? Yes, I will arrange it. Eunuch Meng sighed in his heart. The emperor was still able to deal with His Majesty. Your Majesty is busy with official business. You should relax more. Shun Yu finished speaking and was about to eat the meat in the bowl when he was stopped by the man. Your Majesty, it's not good for your body to be cold. Shang Junlin turned his head and ordered the palace servant, go and change the hot food for the emperor. The palace servant obeyed and left. Shun Yu was stunned and then smiled. His eyes seemed to be full of stars. Your Majesty is so nice. Shang Junlin was stared at by the young man's starry eyes. He could not help but lower his head and sigh, Your Majesty's eyes are so beautiful. Even the most expensive gemstone could not compare to the brilliance of those eyes. Those who stared at them could not help but be immersed in them and give up escaping. Shang Junlin's aggressive aura was too strong. Shun Yu blinked and uncomfortably moved to the side. He felt that Shang Junlin's eyes were not the same as before. Fortunately, at this time, the palace servant brought the dishes. Shang Junlin withdrew his gaze and the atmosphere that made Shun Yu uncomfortable disappeared. The palace servant changed the dishes on the table one by one. Shang Junlin was silent for a while and said, eat it while it's hot. Under the tempting aroma, Shun Yu did not have time to think about Shang Junlin's strange behavior just now. He tasted a few dishes and put the dishes that he liked into Shang Junlin's bowl. Your Majesty, eat with me. The interaction between the two was clearly seen by the ministers below. But they had just suffered a loss under Shun Yu's hands. They did not want to ask for trouble again. They could only pretend that they did not see anything. The Prince of Yu sat in the front position of the vassal king's table. His position was not far from where Shang Junlin and Shun Yu were sitting. He could vaguely hear the voices from above. Hearing Shen Yu's soft voice talking to Shang Junlin, the Prince of Yu silently clenched the cup. When he first approached Shen Yu's attitude had always been very cold. She did not treat him any differently from others. But now, she smiled sweetly in front of Shang Junlin. Her every move was so dazzling that people could not take their eyes off her. So, was he really just a substitute that Shen Yu used to comfort her when she was bored? If it were not for the fact that conditions did not allow him to do so, he really wanted to ask her in person. In what way was he inferior to Shang Junlin? Why was he the substitute of the most annoying person? Unfortunately, since that meeting, he had never found a chance to see Shen Yu again. He used the previous method to send Shen Yu letters and asked people to send things to Shen Yu. Except for the things that were returned intact, the letters that he sent were like a stone that sank into the sea. There was no reply at all. Later on, he encountered all kinds of troubles. He could not even take care of himself, let alone find a chance to see Shen Yu, who had already entered the palace. He wanted to let the spies in the palace pass a message to Shen Yu, but Shang Junlin watched him too closely. Yuzhang Palace was heavily guarded. Once his people appeared, they would be arrested. Before his great cause was accomplished, he absolutely could not expose himself at this time. Why does the Prince of Yu seem to be in a bad mood? Prince Li finished a cup of wine and noticed the ugly expression on the Prince of Yu's face. He followed his line of sight and rolled his eyes. Isn't Prince Li the same? The Prince of Yu's attitude towards Prince Li, who had already sided with Shang Junlin, was not very good. This prince is in a bad mood because my calculations have failed. What about Prince Yu? Prince Li did not mind exposing his scars. As far as this prince knows, Your Highness Prince Yu does not have much of a grudge with the two above. You don't need to worry about this prince's matters. The Prince of Yu took a sip of wine. Under the influence of alcohol, his attitude became even worse. Prince Li should worry more about himself. Because of your own calculations, you have angered Shen Guijun, who is favored by the emperor. Don't lose the emperor's heart because of this. Shen Guijun. Prince Li's voice was heavy. If I had known that he was such a powerful character, I would not have let him enter the palace in the first place. Didn't our good emperor personally choose him to enter the palace? The Prince of Yu keenly sensed something and deliberately asked. Does he really think that he was chosen by the heavens? If no one did anything behind his back, the one entering the palace could have been Madame Zhong. Madame Wang did not have to be Madame Chen. Prince Li explained meaningfully. The Prince of Yu's eyes darkened. As expected. Originally, I only wanted to find a pathfinder. Who would have thought that he would become a roadblock? The Prince of Yu poured himself a cup of wine. The affairs of the world are truly unpredictable. Did you not investigate what kind of person you were sending into the palace before deciding on the candidate? The Prince of Yu couldn't help but ask. What's the use of saying this now? The Prince of Yu raised his wine cup and clinked it with the Prince of Yu's. What we need to consider now is how to remove this roadblock. Aren't you just shooting yourself in the foot by doing this? The Prince of Yu's tone became even more unfriendly when he thought of Shen Yu and the fact that he had been used as a substitute. Why does Your Highness Prince of Yu have to poke at this prince? The one who angered you is not this prince. Every injustice has its perpetrator and every debt has its debtor. The Prince of Yu drained the wine in his cup in one gulp and slowly revealed his true motive. Your Highness Prince of Yu, why don't you come to Huatang residence for a chat after the palace banquet? The Prince of Yu gripped the cup in his hand tightly. After a moment of silence, he said, "Okay." The Prince of Yu returned to his seat in satisfaction. The two of them sat close to each other, so their short exchange did not attract much attention. Shen Yu had been paying a portion of his attention to the Prince of Yu, so he had a panoramic view of the Prince of Yu and Prince Li's actions. He absent-mindedly withdrew his gaze and poured himself a cup of wine. Before he could put it into his mouth, the hand holding the cup was held by Shang Junlin. "Your Majesty." Shen Yu was at a loss. Imperial physician Ji Yu said that it's best if you don't touch wine. His large palm wrapped around Shen Yu's fingers. Shang Junlin leaned forward slightly and drank the wine in his cup in one gulp. "That's my cup," Shen Yu said quietly. Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading Website, mbk50. CC. Chapter 23. Your Majesty is my husband. How could I dislike your Majesty? As long as your Majesty doesn't dislike me, it's fine. Shun Yu looked away and lowered his voice. Surrounded by musical instruments, Shun Yu's voice entered Shang Junlin's ears without being affected. You must be joking. Husband and wife are one. I dislike anyone but you. Shang Junlin slightly curved his lips. The man's hand was big and warm. Shun Yu's hand was completely wrapped in his palm. Shun Yu could feel a steady stream of heat coming from their skin. The palm of his hand was cold, and the back of his hand was hot. A strange feeling spread from his hand to the bottom of his heart. Shun Yu's fingers moved. He wanted Shang Junlin to let go of him. Unexpectedly, not only did the man not let go, but he also increased the strength of his grip. Your Majesty, you should let go of my hand. After maintaining the original position for a while, Shun Yu saw that Shang Junlin still had no intention of letting go, so he had to remind him. Shang Junlin seemed to have woken up from a dream and let go of his hand. Shun Yu immediately took his hand back. His palm was empty, and his heart also seemed to be empty. Shun Yu still felt the man's warmth on the back of his hand. He retracted his hand into his wide sleeves and unconsciously curled his fingers. Shun Yu didn't have a big appetite. After eating a little, he felt full. He stared at the jade-colored wine pot on the small table and licked his lips. The wine was brewed in the palace for a long time. It was mellow and fragrant. The fragrance of the wine seemed to have a long hook, hooking Shun Yu's sense of smell. People were always like this. The more they were not allowed to touch something, the more they wanted to touch it. Shun Yu was obsessed with wine in his previous life. It was not because he drank too much, but because the cold illness in his body could only be alleviated after drinking. It would not make him feel like he was living in an ice cellar. In this life, his physical condition was not as bad as it was in his previous life, and Shang Junlin had instructed him not to let wine appear in his sight, so he did not miss it. But today, the aroma of the wine had suddenly aroused his appetite, and he wanted to taste it even more. Your Majesty, Shun Yu pulled the man's sleeve and said, "Let me have a taste. I promise I'll only take a sip." How come we didn't know that your highness was such a glutton? Shang Junlin raised his eyebrows and looked at the young man. He remembered that according to the news from the hidden dragon guards, Shun Yu did not drink at all. I just want to have a taste. Who asked this wine to be so fragrant? Shun Yu perfectly explained what it meant to be strong even though he was not in the right. You are clearly the one who is greedy, yet you are blaming the wine. Shang Junlin shook his head with a smile. It is not that Jin does not allow you to drink, but Imperial Physician Ji said that your body is not suitable for drinking. I drank when I first entered the palace. Under Shang Junlin's deep gaze, Shun Yu's voice became lower and lower. Why did you stop talking? It seems that your highness did not forget what happened that night. Shun Yu indeed remembered. That day was the first time he had a relapse after his rebirth. He always thought that it was a coincidence, but it turned out that there was another reason. Was my relapse because I drank wine? Shun Yu hesitated. Yes, and no. The wine was just a trigger. Shang Junlin was unwilling to elaborate, and Shun Yu did not want to force him. He could only reluctantly look away and continue to focus on the singing and dancing. Other than the unhappiness at the beginning, the overall atmosphere of the banquet was very good. It was just that some segments were very boring. Towards the end, Shun Yu was a little tired. Your Majesty, I want to go out for a walk. Shang Junlin knew that he was bored and did not stop him. Go, don't stay outside for too long. In order to not attract attention, Shun Yu only took Mushi with him when he left. The palace banquet was getting lively. Other than a few people who had been paying attention to Shun Yu, the others did not notice that Shun Yu had quietly left. King Yu was one of them. Seeing this, he found an excuse and followed him out. Seeing this, Prince Li stroked his beard with a smile in his eyes. He knew that something must have happened between King Yu and Shun Gui Jun. Otherwise, Why would Shun Gui-jun look at him with such a betrayed expression? He waved his hand to summon a servant and ordered in a low voice, "Follow King Yu and report everything to me. Be careful, don't be discovered." "Yes." The servant accepted the order and left. The young emperor who was sitting on the high seat saw this scene and his eyes darkened. He knocked on the table with his knuckles and ordered, "Meng Chang, let the hidden dragon guards follow His Highness." Eunuch Meng was surprised. Seeing His Majesty's cold expression, he swallowed his questions and said, "Yes." Shun Yu did not know that King Yu had followed him out and that King Li's men were following him. He did not go far and found a place to hide from the wind. "Mushi, what else happened on the day I fainted?" "This." Mushi's expression changed slightly. "Young master, I'm not sure." Eunuch Meng handled everything that happened that day. "I only know that, young master, because..." Mushi could not continue. "Because of what?" Shong Junlin did not mention what happened that day. Shun Yu thought that he had only fainted, but now it seemed that this was not the case. Because he was thinking about something, Shun Yu did not notice Mushi's strange expression. "Because young master could not stand your majesty and fainted." After saying it in one breath, Mushi's face turned red. Cough, cough, cough. Hearing this reason, Shun Yu choked on his own saliva. "Is young master okay?" Mushi did not have time to blush. She quickly stepped forward. Her Majesty knows that young master's health is not good, but she still went overboard. "Stop." Shun Yu felt that if he did not interrupt, Mushi would say many more surprising things. What else? Think carefully. What other unusual things happened? If you want to talk about unusual things, does Her Majesty change most of the servants in Yuzhong Palace the next day count? Mushi could only think of this. Most of the palace servants were changed. It seemed that something did happen that night that he did not know, but he did not know if it had anything to do with his sudden illness. It's normal that young master does not remember. Most of the people in that group have never shown their faces in front of young master. "I only found out later," Mushi explained. "No wonder I didn't find anything wrong," Shun Yu muttered. "In fact, I think that Her Majesty is very good to young master except that she doesn't know how to restrain herself." Mushi clearly saw how Shong Junlin treated Shun Yu. Even if she was biased against Shong Junlin at the beginning, she had to admit that Shong Junlin was the person who treated her young master the best. Her Majesty is indeed. Shun Yu suddenly turned his head. "Who?" One Prince Yu walked out of the dark with a dark face, holding a withered branch in his hand. It was the sound of breaking the branch that made Shun Yu find him. "Your Highness." Mushi took a step back and saluted. "Why did Your Highness come out?" Shun Yu looked at Prince Yu as if he was a stranger, which made Prince Yu extremely angry. Especially after hearing the conversation between the two, the anger in his heart had long been surging. He was clearly the one who met Chen Yu first, and he was the one who discovered Chen Yu, this pearl. So why didn't he get anything, and even let the person he hated the most take advantage of him? At that time, when he caught a glimpse of her in the corridor, her jade-like face was deeply imprinted in his heart. If he didn't have a very good impression of her from the beginning, why would he, a dignified prince, lower himself to make friends with her personally? When he quietly followed her out, Prince Yu himself didn't know what he was thinking. He used a disguised identity to make friends with Shun Yu. Now he was Prince Yu, and Shun Yu didn't know him at all. He couldn't do anything even if he followed her out. It was undeniable that Prince Yu had a trace of expectation in his heart that he was unwilling to admit. He hoped that Shun Yu could recognize him, but he was also afraid that Shun Yu could recognize him. With unclear thoughts, he followed them all the way until he heard the conversation between Shun Yu and Mushi. He could no longer keep calm. The person he had never touched before was not only taken by someone else, but also injured by that person's impetuousness. For a moment, Prince Yu didn't even understand whether he was angry that Shun Yu, who he regarded as his possession, was touched by someone else or that Shun Yu was injured by that person. In anger, he broke the dead branch beside him. After being discovered by Shun Yu, he didn't intend to continue hiding and directly walked out. Shun Gui-jun is really in a good mood. Prince Yu stared at Shun Yu's face and saw the indifference on his face. The anger in his heart burned more and more. Why? Why can Shun Yu live with Shang Junlin with a clear conscience as if nothing happened? Why is he the only one who remembers that relationship? Shun Yu didn't feel Prince Yu's anger, but so what? He abandoned the trash in his previous life. Did he have to pick it up again in this life? He didn't have this hobby. Those who make him unhappy, he will definitely return it 1,000 times. Shun Yu, you are really good. Prince Yu took a few steps forward, but Mu Shi stopped in front of Shun Yu and said sternly, "This is the Imperial Palace. Your Royal Highness, please respect yourself." Shun Yu put one hand on Mu Shi's arm and pushed her away. "We don't know each other." "Why do you say that?" "Don't know each other?" Prince Yu's face was gloomy. "Shun Yu, young Master Shun, do we really not know each other?" "Prince Yu is joking." Shun Yu shook his head lightly. "Among the people I know, there is no Prince Yu." "What about Zhao Yu?" Prince Yu stared at Shun Yu's face, trying to see a trace of panic on his face. Unfortunately, Prince Yu was destined to be disappointed. Hearing this name, Shun Yu's face didn't change. "I knew him before I entered the Imperial Palace." "Why? Just know each other?" Prince Yu's eyes were gloomy. "Guijun, tell me, if I tell His Majesty that you have privately promised to marry someone before you entered the Imperial Palace, will he still dote on you like he does now? Prince Yu seems to be very concerned about my affairs. Is it because you also like me?" Shun Yu stopped Mu Shi, who wanted to speak, and asked casually. Prince Yu's chest was filled with depression. Although he didn't want to admit it, to some extent, Shun Yu did say what he was thinking. Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading URL, mbk50. CC. Chapter 24. How could King Yu, who had just been provoked by this matter, hear these words? The veins on his forehead bulged, and he almost used up all his patience to prevent himself from losing his composure. "You weren't like this before." King Yu was so angry that he lost all reason. He blurted out his thoughts. "Are you still blaming this king for not protecting you and causing you to enter the palace?" "Wait." Shun Yu interrupted King Yu's words. He thought, King Yu's tolerance is not good. With just a few words, he revealed all his secrets. In his previous life, King Yu was not so honest in front of him. It was he who guessed King Yu's true identity through clues. Why did he say it so quickly in this life? Was the impact of him entering the palace so big? All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind, but he didn't show it on his face. He pretended to be puzzled and asked, "What does King Yu mean? Why don't I remember having contact with King Yu before entering the palace? What does it have to do with His Royal Highness whether I enter the palace or not?" A series of questions were thrown at King Yu. King Yu's mind, which was occupied by anger, finally sobered up. When he realized what he had said, his face turned ugly. This king, or did King Yu conceal his identity and contact me? Let me guess, King Yu mentioned Zhao Yu just now. Is it possible that His Royal Highness is Zhao Yu? Shun Yu stood on the steps with his arms crossed and looked down at the man in the prince's attire. King Yu didn't expect that Shun Yu could guess the truth with just a few words. He flatly denied, "This king is not." "Then is young Master Wang, young Master Lin, or young Master Shu?" When a name was read out, King Yu's face darkened. He thought that he was a substitute was the limit of his tolerance. He never thought that he might be a substitute, one of the substitutes. Shun Yu pretended to be distressed. "There are a lot of people. How about His Royal Highness tell me directly, which one are you?" "Shun Yu, don't go too far." "I'm going too far." "Who eavesdropped on my conversation with the maid? Who was the one who followed me out? Who deliberately concealed his identity and approached me?" "Your Highness Prince Yu, I also want to know what you want to do." Shun Yu's face turned cold. "This prince is only here to remind you. Don't think that just because you have the Emperor's favor, you can do whatever you want in the palace. There are many people eyeing the position of Empress. If you show off like this, you will only become a thorn in their side. They will only want to get rid of you as soon as possible." King Yu took a deep breath and suppressed the anger in his heart. "You don't have to worry about that. I believe that His Majesty will protect me. After all, His Majesty is not like some people who say that it has to be you, but in the blink of an eye, they can turn a blind eye to that person's predicament and desperately try to make their presence known. Shun Yu walked down the steps and approached Yu Wang step by step. Yu Wang, are you still blaming me? Are you still blaming me for not finding a way to not enter the palace because of you? This king did not. Yu Wang's tone unconsciously lowered. When he first heard the news, that was indeed what he thought. Shun Yu's words were like a gust of wind that blew away his self-deceiving disguise and revealed his selfishness. Shun Yu stepped back slightly and brushed past Yu Wang without any reluctance. Now I really feel that entering the palace was the best choice I have ever made. No matter what identity you used to approach me, there was no connection between us in the past, and there will be no connection in the future. There was only the hatred of 2 lifetimes apart. After the people who secretly followed Yu Wang returned, they reported everything that happened here to Prince Li in full detail. Prince Li stroked his beard. I didn't expect that our Shun Guijun had such a relationship with Yu Wang. Your Highness, should we, with such a big handle, we must grasp it well. Shun Yu, isn't Shun Guijun very arrogant? This king wants to see if His Majesty can still treat him as before after this incident. Yu Wang smiled in a good mood. He didn't expect to find such a big surprise by secretly following Yu Wang. He was just worrying about how to deal with Shun Yu, and the solution came to him. It seemed that even God was on his side. Send someone to investigate carefully. This king wants to know all the details of what happened to Shun Yu before he entered the palace. On the second day of the palace banquet, several people who were disrespectful to Shun Yu at the palace banquet were dismissed. The ministers who had a premonition about this were used to it. His Majesty was already merciful by only dismissing them and not beheading them. In addition, these people's official positions were not high, and their conduct was not completely impeccable. Their disappearance from the court did not cause much of a stir. It was getting closer to the end of the year. Shang Junlin was not as busy as before, and the time he spent in Yuzhong Palace increased day by day. Because it was almost the new year, Shang Junlin simply ordered the vassal kings to spend the new year in the capital before leaving. Your Highness, do you know why His Majesty did not let us go back? In the private room, Prince Li took a sip of wine. Does Imperial Uncle know? Yu Wang really couldn't figure it out. Recently, he had been in a terrible fix because of Shen Qingran's matter, and really had no time to care about other things. I can guess a little. I'm afraid that some people's hearts are too big, and His Majesty wants to use this opportunity to knock some sense into them. Prince Li looked at Yu Wang meaningfully as he spoke. Yu Wang's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't show it on his face. Your nephew really doesn't know. Recently, your nephew has been busy with some personal matters and has no time to care about other things. Prince Li smiled and didn't expose him, but his next sentence almost made Yu Wang jump out of his seat. Imperial nephew, have you considered how to deal with your relationship with Shen Guijun? Now that His Majesty dotes on Shen Guijun so much, if he knew that you had an ambiguous relationship before Shen Guijun entered the palace, wouldn't it? Prince Li didn't finish his sentence, but Yu Wang knew what he meant. The matter between him and Shun Yu could be big or small. If it was used by someone with ulterior motives, all his years of planning would be ruined. Imperial Uncle must be joking. This prince and Shen Guijun don't know each other. How could we have such a relationship? Yu Wang doesn't need to rush to refute. Since this prince dared to speak, I naturally have evidence. Now, you and I have the same goal. Is Yu Wang willing to watch your former lover be in love with someone else for the rest of your life? Prince Li didn't expect that his subordinate would be able to find out such interesting things. It turned out that Yu Wang had secretly come to the capital and even concealed his identity to be on good terms with the legitimate son of Count North. Your Highness, why don't you and I work together? What I want is the position of Empress. If you still want Shen Yu, after this matter is done, you can bring him back to your fief. Yu Wang knew that since Prince Li dared to say it directly, he must know something. But some things were different from the person himself admitting it. After a moment of silence, Yu Wang said, we can work together, but I hope Imperial Uncle understands that the one who has feelings for Shun Yu is Zhao Yu. It has nothing to do with this prince. Prince Li smiled. This prince understands. Your Highness has always stayed in your fief and never left before the imperial edict arrived. A toast to imperial uncle. Yu Wang raised his wine cup and drank it in one gulp. Imperial nephew, if you have any problems, feel free to look for this prince. As long as this prince can help, this prince will definitely not refuse. Yu Wang's hand tightened around the wine cup. Shen Yu. He couldn't stand the sight of Shen Yu staying by Shang Junlin's side. Whenever he thought of it, it was like a ball of fire was burning in his heart. Achoo. Young master, rest early. It's already very late. Mu Shi brought in hot water. Shen Yu put down the pen in his hand and soaked his hand in the hot water. When he felt his body temperature return, he took it out. I'm fine. Young master, will Yu Wang really be fine? Knowing that Zhao Yu was the empress of Yu, Mu Shi had been worried. If Yu Wang spread rumors about what happened back then, would Her Majesty believe her young master? Since ancient times, there were only a few things that men couldn't tolerate the most. Moreover, Her Majesty was the emperor, so she would only be more intolerable. Do you think he will be stupid enough to perish together with me? Mu Shi shook her head. She was just afraid that Yu Wang would be too angry with her young master and expose the matter directly. Besides, there's nothing between me and him. Even if he wants to do something, he won't be able to do it. Shen Yu expected that Yu Wang would not let it go, but he didn't expect it to be in this way. Looking at the men in front of him, Shen Yu stopped in his tracks. What are the two princes doing? Seeing that the weather was good, Shen Yu went out of Yuzhong Palace for a walk and planned to send the late birthday gift to Shang Junlin. He didn't expect to run into Yu Wang and Li Wang. We came specially to find your highness. Can we talk in private? Yu Wang was silent and didn't speak. Li Wang spoke in a seemingly amiable manner. Shen Yu didn't think that they came to find him for anything good, so he didn't want to waste time. If you have something to say, just say it. Then this prince will get straight to the point. Li Wang narrowed his eyes and said slightly threateningly, this prince already knows what happened before your highness entered the palace. If your highness doesn't want this matter to be known to everyone, it's best that you find a way to persuade His Majesty to agree to take a consort. I was wondering what it was. So it's this. Li Wang is really interesting. Why do you think I'll be threatened by you? Shen Yu raised his eyebrows. If it's just for this matter, Li Wang shouldn't waste our time. Does your highness think that His Majesty won't care about this matter? Li Wang couldn't stand Shen Yu's fearless appearance. His tone was vicious. For the time being, we can say that it happened before you entered the palace, so His Majesty can't delve into it. What if this prince says that this prince also knows that after your highness entered the palace, your highness secretly left the palace to meet with an old lover? Shen Yu's expression became a little subtle. Li Wang thought that he had stepped on Shen Yu's sore spot and the corners of his mouth rose. This prince also doesn't want to publicize this scandal to everyone. As long as your highness does as this prince says, this prince guarantees that no one else will mention this matter of your highness meeting with someone else. Your highness should think carefully before answering. Think about what? Shang Junlin's low voice came from the other side. The person who met your highness that day was Zhen. What? Does Li Wang have an opinion about this? This official doesn't dare. The smile on Li Wang's face froze. Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading Website, MBK50. CC. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.